It usually comes at night. Not always. Sometimes it arrives in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, while you are washing dishes or sitting in traffic or doing something so mundane it has no business carrying this kind of weight. But mostly it comes at night, a feeling. Not quite fear, not quite sadness, something older than both. A sudden awareness of being here, of existing, of being conscious, of being temporary, that is so large and so unasked for that the only thing you can do is lie very still and hope it passes. Most people never talk about this feeling, not because it is rare, but because it is almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't felt it, and completely unnecessary to describe to someone who has. Existential dread is not a disorder, it is not a malfunction. It is what happens when a mind that is capable of extraordinary awareness turns that awareness fully on itself and on the nature of its own existence. Every culture in human history has felt it. Every philosopher worth reading has written about it. Every person lying awake right now, in the dark, in a quiet room somewhere in the world, is feeling some version of what you have felt. You are not broken. You are paying attention. Over 25 chapters, we are going to walk through this feeling together, not to cure it, not to explain it away, but to understand it, where it comes from, what it is made of, what people who have carried it longest have learned about living with it. Because the dread, it turns out, is not the enemy. It is the beginning of something. Settle in. Let's find out what. Chapter 1. The 3 a.m. feeling that has no name. It arrives without warning. Not always at 3 in the morning, though that hour has a particular gift for it. The way the night is quiet enough that the ordinary noise of living has stopped, and there is nothing between you and whatever this is. You were asleep, or nearly asleep, and then you were not, and the room that is exactly as it was when you closed your eyes has somehow changed in quality. The darkness has a weight to it. The ceiling is too present. Your own breathing sounds strange, too audible, too mechanical, as though the automatic thing your body has been doing without your attention has suddenly required your attention, and now you cannot stop attending to it. Nothing happened. This is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who has not felt it, and even harder to explain to yourself in the daylight when it has passed and the room is ordinary again. There was no bad dream, no specific thought that arrived and triggered this, no event in the life that the feeling can be attached to, like a label that explains it. The feeling arrived from nowhere, sourceless, and it is enormous in a way that has no object. You are afraid, but there is nothing to be afraid of. You are sad, but there is nothing to be sad about. You are aware of something, but the something has no name, and no location, and no edge you can find to push against. The weight of it is not metaphorical. It sits in the chest in a specific and physical way. It makes the simple acts of breathing and existing feel effortful in a manner they do not feel in the daytime, as though the ordinary agreement between you and the world, the agreement that things will proceed as they have been proceeding, has been temporarily suspended. And in the suspension, you can feel how contingent the agreement always was, how the ordinary life that felt solid and continuous in the light is actually a series of very small agreements, renewed moment to moment. And at 3 in the morning, in the dark, the renewal feels uncertain in a way it does not during the day. The philosophers have touched the edges of this feeling from different directions, without any of them quite landing at the center of it. Heidegger wrote about anxiety as distinct from fear. Fear has an object. You are afraid of the dog, the diagnosis, the confrontation that is coming on Wednesday. Fear is directed. Anxiety, in Heidegger's account, is not directed at anything specific. It is a mood that discloses something about the nature of existence itself, about the groundlessness that ordinary busyness conceals. When the ordinary busyness stops, when the distractions are removed, and the tasks are finished, and the noise has gone, what remains is not peace. What remains is the awareness of the ground beneath the ground, which turns out to be no ground at all, but an openness that the ordinary life was covering. This is closer to the feeling than most descriptions, but it is still a philosophical account of something that is, in the 3 in the morning version, not philosophical at all. It is physical. It is immediate. It is not an insight into the nature of existence, but a confrontation with it that bypasses the thinking mind entirely and arrives in the body before the thinking mind has a chance to frame it, or manage it, or turn it into something that can be held at the appropriate philosophical distance. The Danes have the word angst, which has been imported into English, but lost something in the crossing. In its original context, it contains more than anxiety in the clinical sense. It contains the specific weight of the awareness that things are contingent, that the life you are living is one of many possible lives, that the person you are is one of many possible people you might have been, that the solidity of the self and the life is partly a construction maintained by the ordinary continuity of waking days, and that at 3 a.m, the construction is less convincing than usual. The Danes live with it more openly than most cultures permit. They have a word for it, which is not nothing. Having a word for a thing means the thing has been recognized as a thing that people have, rather than as a malfunction in an individual who should be sleeping. The Japanese concept of mono no aware, the pathos of things, points at a related but different part of the territory. It is the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the specific quality of feeling that arises when beauty and transience are experienced together, when something lovely is seen against the background of its eventual passing. This is present in the 3 a.m. feeling, but it is not the whole of it. Mono no aware has a gentleness to it, a quality of sad appreciation that the 3 a.m. version often does not. The 3 a.m. version is rawer, less aesthetic, less willing to be beautiful. What is being felt in this hour is something that the ordinary life is designed to prevent you from feeling too directly, not through conspiracy or deception, but through the simple, merciful fullness of days, through the tasks and the relationships and the small pleasures and the forward motion that keeps the attention occupied and the awareness pointed at specific things rather than at the general condition of being alive and knowing it, and knowing that it ends. The 3 a.m. feeling is what happens when all of that is suspended, when there is nothing to do and nowhere to be and no one to perform normalcy for, and the body is horizontal in the dark, and the mind, deprived of its usual objects, turns toward the thing it usually turns away from. The feeling is not a malfunction. This is worth saying clearly and more than once. The feeling is not evidence of a broken mind, or a license crisis, or a problem that needs to be solved by morning. It is evidence of consciousness encountering its own conditions, more directly than the daytime usually permits. It is uncomfortable in a way that very honest things are sometimes uncomfortable. The honesty is not the problem. The discomfort is not the disease. It is the sensation of seeing something that is always there, but rarely looked at directly, for the good reason that looking at it directly is difficult, and the looking rarely changes anything practical. And the morning will come, and the tasks will return, and the looking will become unnecessary again. But it happened, and you were there, and you felt something that has no clean name in any language you know, which is perhaps the first honest thing about it, that the feeling is real enough to have arrived, and too large for any word that was made before it came. Chapter 2. The mirror that shows too much. There is a particular loop that the self-aware mind can fall into. It begins with a thought, ordinary enough, the kind of thought that arrives in the course of a normal day. And then a second thought arrives, which is a thought about the first thought, an observation of the observer. And then a third, which watches the watching, and notices itself watching the watching. And the loop is now running, and there's no obvious exit because every attempt to step outside the loop requires a perspective that is itself inside the loop. The watching cannot stop by being watched more carefully. The awareness of the awareness does not dissolve the awareness. It adds another layer to it. And the layers accumulate until what began as a simple thought has become an infinite regress of reflection that has lost any connection to the thing that started it. This experience is not rare. Most people have felt some version of it, the sudden hyper-awareness of the self that makes the self feel strange, foreign, too present and too examined to function naturally. The word for it in psychology is metacognition, thinking about thinking, and in moderate doses it is not only harmless but useful. The person who can step back from their own thought process and observe it tends to catch errors that the purely immersed thinker misses. The capacity for self-reflection is part of what makes genuine learning and genuine moral development possible. It is one of the things that distinguishes mature intelligence from raw processing. But metacognition can tip into something else, into a quality of self-awareness that does not illuminate so much as it paralyzes. The person who is so aware of their own performing of a role that they cannot perform it naturally. The person who is so aware of their own sadness that the awareness becomes a second layer of experience sitting on top of the sadness, observing it, narrating it, and in the narrating creating a distance from the original feeling that makes the feeling neither fully felt nor fully released. The person who is so aware of the impression they are making that every spontaneous gesture has been replaced by a calculated one, and the calculation has replaced the spontaneity so thoroughly that they can no longer remember what they were like before the calculating began. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre described a form of this in his discussion of bad faith, the state in which a person becomes so aware of themselves as an object in the world, a thing that is seen and assessed by others, that they lose access to the being for itself that is the actual source of genuine action and genuine choice, who has so completely inhabited the role that every movement and every gesture has become the performance of waiterness, rather than the spontaneous activity of a person who happens to be waiting tables, is not fully present. They have allowed the role to substitute for the self. They are performing the self rather than being it. And the gap between the performance and the being is the gap that bad faith inhabits. But Sartre was describing a choice, a flight from the anxiety of genuine freedom into the security of a defined role. What this chapter is about is something that arrives without choice, something that is not a flight from anything, but an exposure to something. The moment when the mirror shows too much is not a moment of choosing to be seen as an object. It is a moment when the self becomes strange to itself, without having sought the estrangement. When the ordinary coherence of the self-experience, the feeling of being a continuous and familiar entity moving through a continuous and familiar world, suddenly becomes unavailable and is replaced by something more fragmented and more uncertain and more difficult to operate inside. The philosopher's term for this is depersonalization, when it is experienced as a detachment from the self, and derealization, when it is experienced as a detachment from the world. These are clinical terms for experiences that exist on a spectrum, from the fleeting and ordinary to the severe and disabling. The mild versions are extremely common. The moment of looking in the mirror and not quite recognizing the face as your own. The moment of hearing your own name spoken and feeling that the name belongs to someone slightly other than the person you are right now. The moment of performing a routine action, washing dishes or driving a familiar route, and suddenly being aware of the performance in a way that makes it feel strange, rather than automatic. These moments of mild self-estrangement are part of the ordinary texture of conscious life. They pass, the ordinary coherence reassembles, the familiar self resumes, but sometimes they do not pass quickly. And in the lingering, something is revealed that the ordinary coherence was concealing. The self that feels so solid and continuous and familiar in the normal run of things is, examined closely, a construction. Not a fake or an illusion in any simple sense, but a maintained achievement, something that requires the continuity of certain conditions to remain stable. The memory that connects this moment to the previous moment and the moment before that. The body that feels like the same body that has always been occupied. The narrative that runs from the past through the present toward an anticipated future, and that organizes the experience of being into something that has the shape of a story with a protagonist. When the mirror shows too much, what it shows is the machinery of the construction, the way the self is assembled in each moment from these various inputs, and that the assembly, while reliable, is not inevitable. That a different arrangement of the same materials could produce something that felt less like a coherent self, and more like a collection of processes that happen to share a body. That the person looking in the mirror is not encountering a fixed and independent entity, but a pattern that has been maintained with enough consistency to feel like a thing, rather than an activity. This is not a comfortable thing to see. And the self-awareness that produced the seeing does not, in the moment of the seeing, feel like a gift. It feels like the opening of something that was better closed. The ordinary life is not diminished by the self-awareness that allows you to navigate it thoughtfully, but the specific quality of self-awareness that observes the self-observing itself, that watches the watching until the watching has no stable object, that asks who is doing the looking until the question has no stable answer. This quality of awareness is not the same as thoughtful navigation. It is the mirror turned at an angle that shows the room repeating into itself, and the room is you, and the repetition has no bottom. The people who live with this most continuously, the philosophers and meditators and certain kinds of writers, tend to describe two very different responses to it. One is the response of escalating distress. The loss of the ordinary self-coherence feels like a falling, like a ground that was always there has given way. like a light that was always on has been switched off. The awareness that the self is a construction feels in this response like the discovery that the self is nothing, that the coherence was always false, that the person who felt like a solid and continuous presence was always already a kind of mistake. The other response is different in quality. It involves staying with the seeing long enough for something to shift, for the distress of the initial exposure to settle into something quieter. Not the reassertion of the ordinary self-coherence, which would simply close the mirror again, but a different kind of stability that the mystical traditions across cultures have tried to point toward with varying success. The awareness itself, the thing that is doing the observing of the observer, is not identical to the constructed self it is watching. The mirror that shows too much, if you stay with the showing, eventually shows something that is not in the reflection, something that is doing the looking, something that the looking cannot find as an object because it is the subject, the presence in which all the reflection is occurring. This is not a consolation that arrives in the acute phase of the experience. It is a destination that only becomes available after the initial terror has been metabolized, after the mirror has shown what it shows, and you have stayed with the showing long enough to notice that the one who cannot be found in the reflection was always the one looking. Chapter 3: The Unlived Life Running Alongside Yours. At some point in the past, you made a choice. It does not have to be a dramatic one. It might have been a large choice, the kind that reorganized the structure of your life around a new direction, or it might have been a small one, the kind that seemed minor at the time, and only later revealed itself as a hinge on which something significant turned. You chose this city over that city, this person over that person, or this person over no person, or no person over this person. This career over the other one that was also possible. This yes that closed a door that a no would have left open, or this no that kept the door open while closing something else. The choice was made, the path was taken, and somewhere in the taking, a different path that was real enough to have been taken continued forward without you, into a future you will never inhabit. The ghost of that future follows you, not loudly, not with dramatic presence, not in ways that most people would call haunting in any conventional sense. More quietly than that, as a background presence, an awareness that accompanies you through the life you are actually living, that the life you are actually living is one of the lives you could have had, and that the others, the ones that branched away at each of the decision points, are somewhere running alongside, occupied by versions of you who made different choices and who are right now, in the present moment that you are also in, living those unlived lives and perhaps feeling their own ghosts, which would be you running alongside them. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about the anxiety of possibility. The human being, unlike other animals, is not simply what it is what it is and also what it could be. The awareness of possibility, of the open future that has not yet been determined, is part of what makes human existence distinct. But this openness, which is in one sense the source of human freedom and human dignity, is also the source of a specific and characteristic anxiety. The person who stands before an open future feels not only the excitement of possibility, but the weight of it. The possibility must be closed, a life must be chosen, and every choice forecloses the possibilities it does not contain, producing the specific regret that Kierkegaard identified as inherent to the human condition. Choose and you lose what the other choices would have given you. Do not choose, and the openness itself becomes unbearable. There is no exit from the anxiety of possibility that does not involve loss in one direction or another. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman, working from a very different tradition, identified what he called counterfactual thinking, the tendency of the mind to generate alternative versions of events by asking what might have happened if things had gone differently. This thinking is not unusual or pathological. It is a normal feature of how the mind processes experience, particularly experience that involved loss or failure, or outcomes that feel like they could have been otherwise. The mind that asks, "What if?" is doing something that serves a real function. It is learning from the gap between what happened and what might have happened. It is calibrating future choices by examining past ones. The counterfactual is not only a source of suffering, it is a source of information, but the information it produces does not always arrive in the proportions that are useful. The mind that generates alternative versions of the past is not a neutral simulation engine running all the alternatives with equal vividness. It is biased in specific ways. Alternatives that are close to what actually happened, that required only a small difference in circumstances or a slightly different choice, are more vivid and more emotionally weighted than alternatives that would have required a large departure from what occurred. The person who missed a flight by 5 minutes has a more vivid counterfactual than the person who missed it by an hour. The person who lost an election by a small margin lives more intensely in the world where they won than the person who lost by a landslide. The nearness of the alternative amplifies its weight. This amplification is part of what makes the unlived life such a persistent presence. It is not the wildly improbable alternative that haunts. It is the plausible one, the one that was almost taken, the one where the difference between the path taken and the path not taken was small enough that the mind can easily cross it in imagination and inhabit briefly and uncomfortably the version of the life that came so close to being the actual one. The person who almost moved to the other city, who almost married someone else, who almost took the job that would have changed everything, is accompanied by a ghost who is not a wild fantasy, but a plausible neighbor. A self that is close enough to be recognizable and different enough to produce in its recognition a specific and particular form of longing. The novelist Milan Kundera was interested in what he called the unbearable lightness of being, the specific weight, or rather the absence of weight, that comes from the singularity of life. Each life is lived once. Each choice is made once. The consequence of this singularity is that no choice can ever be tested against its alternatives. You do not know what the other choice would have produced, because you cannot live it. The person who stayed does not know what leaving would have made of their life. The person who left does not know what staying would have made of theirs. The comparison that would allow a genuine assessment of the choice is never available. Life, Kundera argued, is lived in a draft that cannot be revised. Every version is both the final version and the only version, and the lightness of this is unbearable in the specific sense that it offers no weight against which to press. There is no alternative you to compare yourself to. There is only the comparison you make in imagination, which is not a comparison to a real thing, but to a story you have told yourself about a real thing that did not occur. The existentialists tended to respond to this with something like an injunction toward commitment. The anxiety of possibility, the weight of the unlived lives running alongside, is addressed not by choosing differently, but by choosing fully. By inhabiting the chosen life with enough presence and enough investment that the alternatives recede not through denial, but through the genuine occupation of the life that is actually happening. The ghost does not disappear, but the person who is fully present in their actual life is less available to be haunted by it. The haunting requires a vacancy in the present that the ghost can occupy. The fully inhabited present provides no such vacancy. This is easier to say than to do. The fully inhabited present is not always available. There are seasons of life when the vacancy is large, when the actual life feels thin or disappointing, or simply less than it should be. And in those seasons, the ghost of the unlived life has more room. It moves into the space that the actual life is not filling. It offers an imagination, the richness that the actual life is failing to provide. And the offering is seductive in a way that the injunction toward presence does not simply neutralize. What tends to happen to people who sit with this honestly, over a long period, is not the resolution of the haunting, but a change in its quality. The ghost shifts from being primarily a source of regret, of mourning for the life that was not lived, into something more complex. A companion, a reminder of the fullness of the possibility that existed at each of the decision points. Evidence that the life that was lived was not the only life that was available to be lived, which means it was chosen, even when the choosing did not feel like choosing, even when it felt like simply happening. The ghost running alongside is not only what was lost, it is also evidence of what was once possible, of how open the future was before it became the past. And you, standing in the actual life, with its actual texture and its actual limits and its actual gifts, were the one who was there when it happened, and made it this, rather than anything else. Chapter 4. The Smallness That Swallows. There is a particular experience that arrives when you spend real time with the numbers. Not the numbers in the abstract, not the figures that appear in a sentence and are nodded at and passed over because the mind cannot actually hold them, but the numbers sat with, approached slowly, allowed to land with something closer to their actual weight. The observable universe is approximately 93 billion light-years across. A light-year is the distance light travels in a year, moving at roughly 300,000 kilometers per second. The star nearest to our sun is 4 light-years away. The galaxy we inhabit contains somewhere between 100 and 400 billion stars. The observable universe contains somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion galaxies. Each of those galaxies contains billions of stars. Many of those stars have planets. The numbers do not stop being staggering simply because they have been encountered before. When these numbers are genuinely sat with, something happens to the person sitting with them. Not immediately, and not in a simple direction. The first movement is often a kind of vertigo, the sense of the ground giving way beneath the ordinary sense of scale that daily life provides. The world of human concerns, the appointments and the anxieties, and the careful management of the impressions we make on the small number of people whose opinions we have organized our behavior around, briefly loses its ability to feel important. The coffee going cold on the counter is still cold. The meeting still needs to be attended. The argument that happened yesterday still happened. But these things have been momentarily placed against a backdrop that makes their scale visible in a way that the ordinary day does not, and the scale is small in a way that is difficult to fully accommodate. The philosopher Thomas Nagel described the capacity for self-transcendence as one of the distinctive and strange features of human consciousness. We are, he wrote, creatures who can step back from our own perspectives and view ourselves from the outside, from the objective standpoint that does not privilege our particular location or our particular concerns or our particular moment in time. This capacity is what makes science possible. It is what makes ethics possible in the serious sense, the capacity to consider other perspectives as having claims equivalent to our own. But it also produces what Nagel called the absurd, the collision between the sense of importance that human life inevitably generates from the inside and the sense of insignificance that the objective standpoint reveals. We care about our lives immensely. The universe does not appear to reciprocate. The collision between these two facts is the source of a specific kind of existential unease that the cosmic scale makes vivid. The Romantic poets felt this acutely and gave it a name. The sublime was the experience of encountering something so vast or so powerful that it exceeded the capacity of the imagination to contain it. The mountain that dwarfed the human figure standing before it. The storm that reduced the human enterprise to something provisional and exposed. The night sky encountered far from artificial light, full and dense and deeper than any frame could hold. These encounters produced something that was not only terror and not only awe, but a specific combination of both, an experience of being diminished that was also, paradoxically, an experience of being enlarged by the encounter with something genuinely larger than the self. The enlargement is the part that gets underemphasized in discussions of cosmic scale. The smallness is real, and the numbers are genuinely staggering, and the vertigo is appropriate. But the experience of genuine smallness is not only a diminishment, it is also a relief. The weight of self-importance, of the centrality of the self's concerns and the self's story and the self's ongoing management of its place in the social world is lifted briefly by the encounter with something that does not register the self at all. The universe that contains 1 trillion galaxies is not disappointed in you. It does not remember the embarrassing thing you said in 2011. It does not maintain a record of your failures or your inadequacies or the ways you have fallen short of what you intended to be. The smallness that swallows is also a smallness that forgives, not through any intention but through simple indifference, which is the most complete version of not holding anything against you that exists. The astronomer Carl Sagan spent much of his life trying to help people feel the scale of the cosmos without being destroyed by it. His approach was not to minimize the scale, but to locate within it something that he found genuinely moving, rather than only terrifying. The atoms that constitute a human body were forged in the cores of stars that lived and died before the sun existed. We are, in the most literal sense available, made of star stuff. The matter that thinks and feels and worries about whether it left the stove on was produced by processes that operated across billions of years and billions of light years, and that required the specific properties of the physical laws that govern this universe. The smallness of a human life against the cosmic backdrop is real. So is the extraordinary specificity of the conditions required to produce a human life at all. The Buddhist traditions have approached the question of scale from a different direction, but arrived at something adjacent. The self that feels so large and so central and so weighed down by its own importance is, in these traditions, understood to be a construction whose apparent solidity is the source of much of the suffering it experiences. The encounter with vastness, whether through meditation or through the contemplation of impermanence, or through the direct experience of the cosmic scale, is not primarily a source of despair. It is an opportunity to release the grip that the self-sense of its own importance maintains on the experience of being alive. The smallness is not the problem. The belief that smallness is a problem is the problem. What tends to happen to people who develop a genuine ongoing relationship with the scale of things, rather than a single vertigo-inducing encounter, is something more like equanimity than despair. The numbers become less paralyzing and more companionable. The vast dark between the stars is not empty in the way it first appeared. It is full of time and distance, and the slow processes that build complexity from simplicity. The human life that seems negligible against the backdrop turns out on closer examination to be among the most complex arrangements of matter that the universe has so far produced. The brain that is being dwarfed by the numbers it is contemplating is itself one of the most intricate structures known to exist anywhere in the observable universe. The smallness is real, the complexity that is small is also real, and the awareness that can hold both of these simultaneously, that can feel the vertigo of the scale and the strange dignity of being the kind of thing that can feel the vertigo, is perhaps the most specifically human thing there is. The universe does not know it is vast. Only you know that, which is not nothing. Chapter 5, The Clock You Can't Unhear. There is a moment when time changes. Not when it speeds up, though that is how it is usually described, and not when it slows down, though certain moments within it do. There is a moment when time becomes audible in a way it was not before. When what had been simply the medium through which life was moving becomes itself an object of awareness. When you notice not only what is happening, but that it is happening now and will not be happening later, that the now is already becoming then even as it is occurring, that the very act of experiencing the present moment includes within it the awareness that the present moment is passing. Before this moment, time is simply there. The child who is fully inside the summer does not experience the summer as finite. The teenager who is absorbed in the intensity of early feeling does not step outside the feeling to note that the feeling will eventually subside. The young person building their life does not, for the most part, experience the building as occurring against a background of limited time. The time is just there, ahead more of it than can be used, a resource so abundant that conserving it has not yet become a concern. Life experienced from inside this relationship to time has a particular quality of openness. The future is genuinely open. The past is thin. The present is all there is. And then something happens. It is different for different people. Sometimes it is a specific event. The death of a parent, which installs death in the conceptual landscape of the life for the first time as a personal fact rather than an abstract category. The realization that certain things are no longer possible, not because they are forbidden, but because the window for them has quietly closed. The moment of looking at a photograph from 10 years ago and recognizing with a quality of recognition that photographs sometimes produce, that the person in it was younger than you remember feeling, and that the distance between that person and the current one is larger than expected. These events do not create time's finitude. They reveal it to a mind that was not previously attending to it. The psychologist Erik Erikson described middle life as the period in which the dominant temporal framework of a life shifts from time since birth to time until death. The young adult measures their position in the life from its beginning. They are 22 years old, which means they have been alive for 22 years and are early in the process. The middle-aged person measures their position in the life from its anticipated end. They are 50, which means they have on average something in the range of 30 more years. The arithmetic has flipped. The dominant reference point is no longer the beginning, which recedes, but the end, which approaches. And the approach of the end, once it has been made vivid by the arithmetic, is difficult to make not vivid again. Heidegger called this being toward death, a specific character of human existence that arises from the awareness of finitude. For Heidegger, this awareness was not primarily a source of despair, but a source of meaning, the thing that makes genuine choice possible by making clear that the choices are real, that the time is limited, that the life has a shape because it has an end. A life that could go on indefinitely in all directions would not have the same quality of importance that a finite life has. The importance is partly produced by the finitude. The ticking is what makes the moments count. But knowing that the ticking makes the moments count does not make the ticking comfortable. The philosophical account of why finitude produces meaning does not dissolve the 3 in the morning awareness of the time that has already passed and the time that remains. The two things, the meaning-producing quality of finitude and the existential discomfort of being aware of it, coexist. They do not cancel each other. The person who has internalized the philosophical account of being toward death and the person who wakes at 3 in the morning with the weight of time on their chest are often the same person. The poet Philip Larkin wrote about this with a directness that most writing on the subject avoids. His poem about death is not philosophical or consoling. It is simply honest about the fear, in a way that makes the fear recognizable to people who have been pretending the fear is not there. The unremarkable ordinariness of the fear, the way it arrives in the middle of a normal night in a normal room and is not exotic or noble, but simply frightening, is what makes the poem land as it lands. The clock that cannot be unheard is not heard dramatically. It is heard in the most ordinary circumstances, which is its specific quality of unrelenting presence. The awareness of time passing has a particular relationship to memory and to the experience of pleasure. The psychologist Mark Wiseman has written about what he calls temporal self-appraisal, the tendency of people to evaluate their current self in comparison to their past self, which tends to become more active as the past self becomes more distant. The young person who is thin or fast or sharp or capable in ways that the current person is not. The version of the self that existed in a period of peak vitality or peak possibility, before the narrowing that every life undergoes as it commits to specific paths and specific identities. The comparison is not always useful, but it is almost unavoidable once the clock has become audible, because the clock measures not only time remaining, but time already spent, and the spending can be felt as loss in ways that the gaining of the present life does not always compensate. What tends to happen to people who develop a workable relationship with the audible clock, rather than either denying it or being destroyed by it, is a shift in attention, not toward the future, which the awareness of finitude makes feel more pressured, but toward the present, which the awareness of finitude makes feel more specific. The moment that is happening now, and will not be happening later in the way it is happening now. This observation, which sounds like a tautology, actually does something when it is felt, rather than thought. It makes the present moment more specifically itself. The conversation happening right now is this conversation, with this specific texture, with these specific people, or this specific solitude, and it is this rather than any other thing, and the thisness of it is available to be attended to in a way that the unaware, time-abundant version of the self did not fully attend to. The clock cannot be unheard. This is the straightforward truth of the matter. The awareness of time's passage, once it has genuinely arrived, does not then unarrive. It becomes part of the equipment of consciousness, a background awareness that is always present even when it is not the foreground. The question is not how to silence it, which is not available. The question is what kind of hearing it becomes over time. Whether the ticking is primarily a source of dread or primarily a source of attention. Whether the awareness of the passing is experienced as loss or as the specific aliveness of a moment that is here now and nowhere else. The clock is running. It was always running. You simply hear it now. And the hearing, while it cannot be undone, is also the thing that makes this particular moment feel like something worth being in, rather than something happening on the way to somewhere else. Chapter 6. The freedom that feels like falling. There is a version of the story of human freedom that is told as a triumph. We are not determined. We are not fixed by nature or bound by fate or confined to a role assigned before we arrived. The universe does not have a plan for us. The life we are living is not the fulfillment of a destiny written somewhere in advance. We are, in the most complete sense available, free to choose what we do, who we become, what meaning we make from the raw material of our existence. This is presented as the great gift of the modern understanding. The liberation from the pre-modern frameworks that assigned each person a place and a purpose and a path from which deviation was not only difficult, but sinful. We have been freed from that. We stand in the open. The field extends in every direction, without a fence in sight. For some people, this story is experienced as described. The openness is genuinely experienced as openness. The absence of a predetermined purpose is felt as possibility, rather than as void. The freedom to choose the meaning of one's own life is received as what it is claimed to be, which is a gift, even an overwhelming one, but a gift nonetheless. These people exist and their experience of freedom is real, and it would be wrong to suggest that the existential openness is always and only a source of distress. But for others, and more others than the triumphant version of the story tends to acknowledge. The same openness is experienced entirely differently. Not as a field extending in every direction, as falling, as the specific sensation of a ground that should be there not being there, as the physical experience of what happens to the body when support is suddenly absent, the lurch in the stomach, the reaching for something to hold, the awareness that the falling is not going anywhere specific, but is simply falling, which is the most frightening kind. Jean-Paul Sartre's account of radical freedom is one of the most honest attempts to describe what genuine openness actually feels like from the inside. He did not describe it as comfortable. He described it as dizzying. The human being condemned to be free, in his famous phrase, is not liberated in any comfortable sense by the absence of a predetermined essence. The absence means that there is no guide, no instruction set, no pre-given answer to the question of what to do with the life or who to be inside it. Every moment requires a choice, and every choice is made without the support of a framework that would make the choice clearly correct. The freedom is real, and it is also the reason that anxiety, for Sartre, is the authentic mood of human existence, not a malfunction to be corrected, the accurate registration of what the situation actually is. The philosopher Erich Fromm, working from a psychoanalytic rather than existentialist tradition, wrote about what he called the escape from freedom. His observation was that the freedom that modernism produced, the liberation from the fixed roles and fixed authorities of pre-modern life, was psychologically unbearable for many people, not because they were deficient or cowardly, but because the freedom was genuine, and the genuine freedom was genuinely frightening. The response was not gratitude but a reaching for new authorities, new fixed frameworks, new certainties that could perform the function of the old ones. The authoritarian movements of the 20th century, Fromm argued, were partly expressions of the psychological demand for the kind of groundedness that genuine freedom removes. The people who were most attracted to them were not primarily driven by ideology, they were driven by the need to stop falling. This analysis is over 80 years old, and the specific political context Fromm was writing about has changed. But the psychological observation retains its accuracy. The person who, confronted with genuine openness, reaches for a framework that will tell them what to do, and who to be, and what the purpose of the life is not necessarily making an error. They are responding to a genuine feature of their situation. The openness is real, the falling feeling is the accurate registration of the openness. And the reaching for something to hold is a reasonable response to falling, whatever the thing is that gets reached for. The psychologist Rollo May, who worked at the intersection of existentialism and clinical psychology, was interested in what he called the courage to create, which he understood as the capacity to remain in the openness rather than fleeing from it. This courage was not the absence of anxiety, it was the willingness to act in the presence of anxiety without being paralyzed by it. The artist who creates does not create because the creation is certain or safe or guaranteed to produce meaning. They create in spite of the uncertainty, in the presence of the anxiety, using the openness as material rather than treating it as threat. The falling in this understanding is not a problem to be solved by finding a ground, it is a condition to be inhabited, which requires a different relationship to the absence of ground than the relationship of someone who needs the ground to be there. This is easier to describe than to live. The capacity to inhabit the falling, to remain open in the openness, to work with the absence of predetermined purpose rather than fleeing from it or being destroyed by it, is not evenly distributed and is not simply a matter of choosing to be braver than the anxiety. It depends on resources that are not equally available. The person who has a secure sense of self from which to explore the openness is in a different position from the person whose sense of self is itself part of what the openness has unsettled. The person who has meaningful relationships that provide a kind of ground, even in the absence of metaphysical certainty, is in a different position from the person whose relationships are also part of what is uncertain. The openness is the same. The experience of it is shaped by what surrounds it. What the freedom that feels like falling asks of a person is not that they stop feeling the falling. The falling is accurate. The ground is genuinely not there in the ways it might have seemed to be there in other times and other frameworks. What it asks is a different orientation to the falling, not the desperate reaching for something that will stop it, which tends to produce either rigidity or exhaustion, but a willingness to ask what it would mean to be a person for whom falling was not primarily a catastrophe, what a life would look like that was lived from the falling rather than in spite of it. What becomes possible when the absence of a predetermined purpose is treated not as the removal of a ground, but as the availability of a genuine question that was not available when the ground was in place. The question of what to do with a free life is not the same question as the question of what a predetermined life required of you. It is harder, it is more genuinely yours, and the falling that accompanies it is the feeling of a life that has not yet been told what it is, which is terrifying, and is also the only condition in which it can become something that was not already decided before you arrived to live it. Chapter 7: The Performance Nobody Assigned You. At some point in a normal day, something happens that is so routine it usually escapes notice entirely. You are about to walk into a room, or answer a phone call, or begin a conversation, and something in you makes a small adjustment. Not a dramatic transformation, a calibration. The voice shifts slightly in register. The posture adjusts. Something in the face settles into a configuration that is not entirely different from the configuration of the moment before, but is not identical to it either. The person who walks into the room is a version of you that has been prepared for this specific audience and this specific context. And the preparation happens so quickly and so automatically that it does not feel like a performance. It feels like simply arriving. But it was a preparation. And the preparation implies a self that exists before the preparation, which is then adjusted for the context, which means the adjusted version is not quite the same as the unadjusted version, which raises the question of whether the unadjusted version is ever actually available, or whether the self is always already prepared for some audience, always already in some version of the calibration that the walk into the room made explicit. The sociologist Erving Goffman spent much of his career studying what he called the presentation of self in everyday life. His argument was that social interaction is fundamentally theatrical in structure. People manage the impressions they make on others with the same kind of attention and skill that an actor brings to a performance. The front stage, where the interaction occurs, is distinguished from the backstage, where the performance can be dropped and the exhausting work of impression management can be temporarily suspended. The backstage is the bathroom break. The backstage is the conversation with the person who knows you well enough that the calibration can be reduced to something more like its baseline. The backstage is the moment alone in the car before walking into the office, or the moment after the guests have left, when the face can do what it wants without the management. Goffman was not making a cynical argument about human inauthenticity. He was making an observational argument about the structure of social interaction. The performance is not primarily deceptive, it is adaptive. It is the mechanism through which the self navigates the different contexts and different audiences that a social life involves. The person who presents differently in a job interview than they do at a childhood friend's dinner party is not being dishonest in either context. They are being appropriately responsive to the different demands of different social situations. The performance is a feature of social competence, not of social pathology. But the performance has costs that the structural account tends to understate. The cost of the constant monitoring, the energy required to maintain the calibrated version across the duration of a social encounter, the specific fatigue of the person who has performed across a long day and arrives home not only tired from the work, but tired from the performance of managing the presentation of themselves through the work. The introvert's exhaustion after sustained social engagement is partly the exhaustion of the content of the engagement and partly the exhaustion of the performance that accompanied it. The two are difficult to separate because they occur simultaneously, but they are not the same thing. There is a deeper cost that the performance involves, which is harder to name and harder to measure. The self that is perpetually calibrated for its audience can lose track of the version of itself that exists before the calibration. The backstage can shrink. The moments where the management is genuinely suspended can become rarer, and if the backstage becomes small enough or absent enough, the question of what the self actually is when it is not performing for anyone becomes a question that does not have a clear answer. Not because the self does not exist, but because so much of what is known about the self has been generated in the context of its presentation to others that the self apart from presentation is no longer clearly accessible. This is the existential version of the performance problem, which goes beyond Goffman's sociological account. The sociological account is about the management of impressions. The existential account is about what happens to the self when impression management has become so pervasive and so automatic that the question of the authentic self, the self beneath the performances, is no longer simply unanswered, but uncertain whether it has an answer. The person who has been performing long enough may no longer know what they would be like if they stopped. The stopping, if it occurred, might produce not the relief of the authentic self finally visible, but the vertigo of not finding anything specific where the performance used to be. The philosopher Charles Taylor wrote about what he called the ideal of authenticity, the specifically modern notion that each person has an original way of being human that is genuinely their own, and that the moral task is to discover and express this originality rather than to conform to external standards. This ideal, Taylor argued, is both genuine and corrupted in modern culture. Genuine because there is something real about the intuition that persons have inner depths that external performance does not fully express. Corrupted because the ideal of authenticity has been absorbed into a culture of self-presentation that uses the language of authenticity to describe what is actually another level of performance. The person who constructs a carefully managed appearance of authenticity, who performs the authentic self for an audience that has been told to value authenticity, has not achieved what the ideal was pointing toward. They have added a meta-level of performance to the performance. What makes the performance particularly exhausting in the current moment is the scale at which it now operates. The social performance that Goffman analyzed occurred in face-to-face interaction in bounded contexts with specific audiences. The performance that contemporary social life requires occurs across platforms and contexts that are not bounded in the same way, that persist over time in ways that face-to-face interaction does not, that create a documented record of the performed self that can be consulted and evaluated by audiences who were not present at the original performance, and by versions of the self looking back at previous performances. The management of the presentation of self has acquired a scale and a permanence that the original form of the performance did not have. The exhaustion that this produces is not primarily the exhaustion of hypocrisy. Most people are not performing selves they do not recognize as their own. They are performing selected and calibrated versions of genuine selves, which is a different thing. The exhaustion is the exhaustion of selection and calibration maintained across a life, across multiple contexts and multiple audiences simultaneously, without a backstage large enough to genuinely rest in. What would it mean to rest? Not to stop being social, not to withdraw from the contexts that require the calibration, but to find within the full range of who you are something that does not feel like performance. Not because it is hidden from others, but because it is not organized around how it will be received. Not because it is secret, but because its existence does not depend on an audience. The part of you that occurs when no one is watching, not as a truer or more authentic self that the performance was concealing, but as a different quality of being that does not require the management to be what it is. The performance nobody assigned you is still yours. The role was self-generated, self-maintained, self-directed. But the exhaustion of it is also genuinely yours, and the rest that waits on the other side of stopping, even briefly, even imperfectly, is also something you are entitled to, without needing to perform the stopping. Chapter 8. The question underneath every question. There is a structure to the search for meaning that most people do not notice because they are inside it. The search begins somewhere specific, with a career that does not feel like enough, or a relationship that has ended, or a success that arrived and failed to produce what was expected of it, or simply a Tuesday afternoon with nothing obviously wrong and the specific quality of emptiness that Tuesday afternoons with nothing obviously wrong can produce. The search begins with a specific question. What should I do with my life? What do I actually want? Why does this not feel like enough? These are real questions, and the search they initiate is real search. But the search, followed honestly and far enough, does not stay with the specific question it began with. The specific question points toward a more general question, and the more general question points toward a more general question still. And the questions nest inside each other in a way that the person who began by asking what career to pursue has not anticipated and did not sign up for. The career question becomes a question about what makes a life worthwhile, which becomes a question about what value is and where it comes from, which becomes a question about whether value is built into the structure of things or imposed by minds that need it to be there, which becomes a question about whether the universe has any structure that would support the kind of value that would make the career question answerable in a way that goes beyond personal preference. And the person who began asking about their career is now at the dark door. The dark door is the question of whether any of it means anything. Not this specific arrangement of a life, not this particular career or relationship or achievement, but the whole of it. Whether the human project, with its extraordinary complexity and its brief duration against the backdrop of cosmic time, is pointed toward anything. Whether there is any account of what is happening here that would make the caring that human beings inevitably do about their lives make sense in a way that is not simply the self-serving story of creatures who cannot tolerate the alternative. Albert Camus called this the only truly serious philosophical question, whether life is worth living. Not in the crisis sense, not in the clinical sense of someone assessing whether to continue, but in the philosophical sense of whether the human activity of living, of pursuing projects, and forming attachments and caring about outcomes is the recognition that the human demand for meaning and the universe's silence in response to that demand creates a tension that cannot be resolved in either direction. The meaning cannot be found in the universe, which does not have it. The demand for meaning cannot be suppressed because it is constitutive of human consciousness. The honest response is to live in the tension, fully, without resolving it in the direction of false hope or false despair. This is easier to write than to live. The dark door, when you arrive at it, does not feel like a philosophical position. It feels like a physical experience. The specific quality of sitting with the question of whether any of this means anything, when the question is real rather than theoretical, is one of the more difficult experiences that consciousness can produce. The ground that the specific questions about careers and relationships were standing on has given way. The specific questions, which seemed pressing when they initiated the search, now feel small in relation to what the search has found. The answer to the career question does not help with the question underneath it, which has turned out to be the question that the career question was always really asking. The existentialist tradition has several responses to the dark door, none of which are entirely satisfying, and all of which contain something real. Sartre's response is that meaning is created by human beings, rather than found in a universe that does not contain it. The radical freedom that makes the falling feeling possible also makes the creation of meaning possible. The meaning you give your life is not given to you by anything outside you. It is made by you, through your commitments and your choices and the way you inhabit the life you are living. This response has the advantage of honesty about where the meaning comes from. It has the disadvantage of leaving open the question of whether created meaning is the same thing as the meaning that was being searched for. The meaning that was demanded was meaning that would hold without the person demanding it. Created meaning holds only as long as the creator maintains the commitment. Whether that is meaning in the relevant sense is the question the response does not fully answer. Camus' response of the absurd recommends a kind of defiant engagement with the situation, not a surrender to meaninglessness and not a flight into false certainty. A clear-eyed acceptance of the tension between the demand for meaning and its unavailability, combined with the decision to live fully within the tension. His image of Sisyphus, condemned to push the boulder up the hill for eternity, is meant to be understood as a figure of genuine engagement rather than despair. Camus says we must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because the situation has changed, but because the genuine engagement with the situation, without illusion and without despair, is itself a form of dignity that does not require the universe to validate it. Viktor Frankl, writing from inside the extreme situation of the concentration camp, arrived at a different response. His observation was that even in conditions of total external deprivation, human beings retain the capacity to choose their orientation to their situation. Meaning was not found in circumstances, which could be taken. It was found in the attitude toward circumstances, which could not be taken, or could only be surrendered willingly. The meaning of a life is not determined by what happens to it, but by what the life does with what happens to it. This response is both more concrete than Sartre's and more resistant to the darkest version of the question. It has been criticized for placing too much demand on individuals in situations of genuine extremity, but it contains a genuine observation about the relationship between meaning and response that extends beyond the extreme situation. What all of these responses share is the refusal to look away from the dark door once it has been found. The search that led there was honest. The question written on the door is real. The response that pretends the question is not there, that retreats to the specific questions about careers and relationships, and treats them as if they were not pointing toward the deeper one, is not available to the person who has genuinely arrived at the door. The questions nest inside each other. The door, once seen, has been seen. What is written on it underneath the question of whether any of this means anything, is something that is different for different people and that cannot be read from outside. It is not the same text for everyone. It is written in the specific language of the person who arrived at the door through their specific search, which is why the door cannot be described in advance, and why every description of it is inadequate for the person actually standing there. The door is dark, not because it contains nothing, but because what it contains cannot be read by the light that was available before you arrived. The reading requires a different kind of seeing, which the arrival at the door is, itself, beginning to produce. Chapter 9. The body you forgot you were there is a period in a life when the body is simply not a problem, not a resource that is being managed or a limitation that is being worked around, or a source of information about mortality that requires acknowledgement. Simply a vehicle. The thing that carries the self from place to place, that does what is asked of it without requiring much negotiation, that heals from damage quickly enough that the damage does not register as a significant category of experience. During this period, the self and the body are not experienced as separate things in any felt sense. The self is in the body the way water is in a glass, occupying it completely without the occupation being remarkable or requiring attention. This period ends. Not all at once and not for everyone at the same time or in the same way, but it ends. There is a first time the body does not recover from something as quickly as expected. A first time something hurts that did not hurt before and goes on hurting in a way that does not resolve. A first time the face in the mirror shows something that the internal sense of the self does not match. Not dramatically, not the dramatic discontinuity that illness can produce, but a small and specific discrepancy between the self that feels like a certain age inside and the body that is recording a different number in its accumulating history. The body has been keeping its own account, separate from the self's account of itself, and the two accounts do not always agree. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty spent much of his career thinking about what he called the lived body, the body as it is experienced from the inside rather than the body as it is understood from the outside. His observation was that the lived body is not an object that the self possesses or inhabits. It is the medium through which the self encounters the world. The hand that reaches for a glass does not experience itself as a hand. It experiences the glass, the texture of it, the temperature of it, the weight of it. The body is, in Merleau-Ponty's account, the condition of experience rather than one of the objects of experience. It is what allows you to be in the world rather than something you are in. This description captures what the healthy body in its prime years feels like from the inside. The body that works without requiring attention is transparent in the phenomenological sense. It does not insert itself between the self and its engagement with the world. It simply enables the engagement. The self reaches through the body toward the world, and the body does not resist or redirect or call attention to itself in the process. The medium is invisible. The world is what is visible. What happens when the body fails, or ages, or produces pain, or is confronted with its own finitude through illness, or the gradual accumulation of its limitations, is that the transparency breaks down. The body becomes visible as the medium it has always been. The hand that reaches for the glass now reports something about itself in the reaching, a stiffness or an ache or a hesitation that was not there before. The body has become opaque. It has inserted itself into the experience in a way that it was not previously doing, and this insertion is the beginning of a different relationship to the body than the one that was available before. The existential tradition calls this thrownness, the condition of finding oneself already in a situation that was not chosen. Heidegger's term names the specific quality of discovering that the situation of the self includes a body that is aging, that will eventually fail completely, that carries a history of damage and repair, that is subject to forces that the self did not consent to and cannot entirely control. The body was always this. The discovery of it, the moment when the self becomes aware of the body as a finite and contingent thing rather than a transparent medium, is the moment when thrownness is felt rather than merely named. This discovery arrives differently at different ages and with different emotional textures. The young adult who experiences serious illness encounters it in a context where the encounter is unexpected, and the contrast with the previous transparency is sharp and disorienting. The illness coming when the body was supposed to be in its period of reliable function has a quality of premature arrival. It interrupts a relationship between self and body that was not supposed to be interrupted yet. The middle-aged person who begins to notice the accumulation of the body's record has a different experience. The The changes are gradual enough that no single moment carries the full weight of the discovery. Instead, there is a series of small discoveries, each of which is absorbed into the ongoing life, but which collectively produce a relationship to the body that is different from the one that existed before they began. The older person who has been living with the body's increasing opacity for decades has developed, in many cases, a relationship to the body that the younger person does not have access to. Not acceptance in the simple sense of having made peace with what cannot be changed, though that may be part of it. Something more complex. A familiarity with the body as a thing that has its own trajectory, its own demands, its own relationship to time that is not identical to the self's relationship to time. The self may feel ageless in certain moments, in the moments of full absorption in something that matters, when the self is entirely in the world rather than observing itself being in the world. The body does not feel ageless in those moments. The body keeps its own account regardless of whether the self is attending to it. There is a specific kind of awareness that illness produces that is different from the awareness that aging produces. Illness makes the body suddenly and specifically present in a way that aging makes it gradually and generally present. The person with a fever, or a broken bone, or a diagnosis that requires active treatment is experiencing the body as a problem that occupies the foreground of attention. The body that was transparent has become entirely opaque, a loud and demanding presence that the self cannot look away from. This opacity has a quality of strangeness, of the estrangement that Merleau-Ponty's account of the lived body would predict. The body that has become an object rather than a medium is a body that feels less like the self and more like something the self is confronted with. The spiritual traditions have approached the body's mortality with varying degrees of directness. The Buddhist tradition's emphasis on impermanence treats the body's transience not as a problem to be solved, but as a fact to be fully acknowledged, because the full acknowledgement of it is the beginning of the freedom that comes from not building the self-security on what is inherently unstable. The Stoic tradition recommended a practice of negative visualization, the deliberate imagining of what will eventually be lost, as a method for cultivating appreciation for what is currently present, and equanimity about what is eventually absent. Both traditions share the understanding that the body's mortality, avoided or denied, does not become more manageable. It becomes more frightening, more capable of producing disproportionate responses when it finally asserts itself in ways that cannot be denied. What the body that has become visible is showing is not only its limitation, it is also its history. The accumulation of what it has done and where it has been and what it has survived. The body that aches from an old injury is the body that received and healed from the injury, which means the body that was in the specific place and the specific life when the injury occurred. The body that moves more slowly is the body that has moved through decades, that has been the medium through which all the experiences of those decades were lived. The opacity of the aging body is not only the opacity of limitation, it is also the opacity of depth. The body you forgot you were is still the body you are, and the forgetting when it ends is the beginning of a different kind of knowing. Not the transparent knowing of the medium that requires no attention, but the specific and particular knowing of something that has been with you the entire time, keeping its account in ways you are not attending to. Until now.
Chapter 10. The connection that cannot close the gap.
There is a moment in certain relationships that arrives without warning and produces a specific quality of feeling that has no common name. You are with someone you love, not in a moment of conflict or distance or the ordinary friction that relationships produce, but in a moment of genuine closeness. The conversation has gone somewhere real. The presence is full. Whatever the two of you are to each other has been in this moment genuinely expressed and genuinely received. And then in the middle of this, a thought arrives. Not a hostile thought, not a sign that something is wrong with the relationship or with the moment. A quiet, clear observation that whatever is happening in you right now, the specific quality of this moment as you are experiencing it, the particular interior texture of being here with this person in this way, cannot be transferred. That the experience is yours and only yours in a way that no intimacy, however genuine, can fully bridge. The thought passes, the moment continues, but the thought was true. And the truth of it, encountered in a moment of genuine closeness, has a specific poignancy that makes it different from the same truth encountered in solitude, where it is simply the condition of being alone, rather than a discovery made in the middle of not being alone. The philosophical problem of other minds is the most formal version of what this moment reveals. How do you know that other people have inner lives? You cannot access another person's consciousness directly. You cannot verify from the inside that what is happening inside you has any equivalent in what is happening inside them. You infer the inner lives of others from their behavior, their language, their expressions, their reports of their experience. But inference is not access. The inference that other people are conscious, that they have genuine interior experiences rather than simply behaving as though they do, is an inference that is extremely well supported, and that almost no one seriously doubts. But it remains an inference. The direct access that you have to your own experience is not available for any other experience in the world. This asymmetry is permanent. It is not a problem that can be solved by communication, however good the communication is. The person who describes their inner experience most accurately, using language that lands with the precision of genuine understanding, has not transferred the experience. They have produced in the listener an experience that resembles their own, perhaps closely, perhaps with extraordinary fidelity. But the resemblance is a resemblance between two distinct experiences, not a sharing of one experience. The gap is not closed by the bridge. The bridge is built across the gap, and the gap remains. Martin Buber distinguished between two fundamental modes of relation that a person can have with the world. The I-it relation, in which the other is encountered as an object, a thing with properties that can be known and used and assessed. And the I-thou relation, in which the other is encountered as a subject, as a genuine other self whose interiority is met, rather than merely inferred. The I-thou encounter for Buber is the mode of genuine relation, the mode in which the human being is most fully present and most fully met by the presence of another. It is the mode of love, of genuine friendship, of the encounter with art or nature that produces something more than aesthetic assessment. But even the I-thou encounter in Buber's account is a relation between two. It does not dissolve the twoeness into oneness. The genuine meeting of two subjects does not produce a single shared subject. It produces the specific quality of being met, of having the interiority that is usually only accessible to oneself, encountered by another interiority from outside. The encounter is real. The gap is not closed by the encounter. The encounter occurs across the gap, and the gap is what makes the encounter possible. If there were no gap, if the two merged into a single consciousness, there would be no meeting. The meeting requires the twoeness. The Romantic tradition's account of love is in some versions a resistance to this. The idea of the soulmate, the other half, the person whose presence makes you complete, is an account in which love is the closing of a gap rather than the meeting across one. The incompleteness that love addresses in this account is a real incompleteness, and the right love genuinely resolves it. This account has produced some of the most powerful literature and music and art that human beings have made. It has also produced some of the most destructive expectations about what relationships can and should provide. The person who arrives at a relationship expecting it to close the gap, who brings to it the full weight of the loneliness that the fundamental aloneness of consciousness produces, is asking the relationship to do something that relationships are not structured to do. And the inevitable failure to do it can be experienced as a failure of the relationship or the partner, rather than as the accurate discovery that the gap is constitutive rather than contingent. The gap does not mean that connection is not real or not valuable. This is the misreading of the situation that produces the despair rather than the equanimity. The connection that occurs across the gap is genuine connection. The love that cannot close the distance between two separate centers of consciousness is still love. The understanding that reaches across the gap and produces in another person the experience of being understood is real understanding. The fact that it is imperfect, that the understanding is always an approximation, that the resemblance between two experiences never becomes identity, does not make the reaching worthless. It makes the reaching extraordinary. That connection is possible at all, given the fundamental aloneness of each consciousness, given the impossibility of direct access to any experience other than one's own, is remarkable rather than disappointing. The loneliness that this awareness produces is not the loneliness of isolation. It is something more subtle and more permanent than that. It is the loneliness of interiority, the specific quality of having an inside that is irreducibly one's own, that cannot be fully known from outside, that will accompany you through every connection you make and every love you enter, and will still be there, quietly, when the connections are at their most genuine and the love is most fully expressed. The awareness of it in the middle of genuine closeness is not a sign that the closeness has failed. It is a sign that the closeness is real enough for the structure of the situation to become visible. Two people in a room, fully present, genuinely loving, completely themselves, and the space between them, not empty, not a failure, but the actual medium of their meeting, the distance across which everything real between them has always traveled. Chapter 11. The Work That Doesn't Remember You. There is a pyramid in Egypt that was built by a pharaoh whose name we know. He wanted to be remembered. He devoted the labor of thousands of people across decades to the construction of something so large and so permanent that the forgetting would be impossible. The stone would outlast the language of the people who built it, the civilization that housed it, the religion that gave it meaning. The name would persist. The permanence was the point. And 4,500 years later, the pyramid is still there. The name is still known. By almost any measure of human ambition, the project succeeded. And yet the pharaoh is not remembered in any sense that would have satisfied the pharaoh. The person who wanted to be remembered, the specific interior life that feared the oblivion it was building against, is gone in exactly the way that ordinary people with no pyramids are gone. The name persists without the person. The monument stands without the consciousness that erected it. What was preserved is a label attached to a structure, and the structure exists in a context so different from the one that produced it that whatever meaning it carried in its original context has been replaced by a different meaning, the meaning assigned by the people who encounter it now, who are not the audience the pharaoh was building for, and who relate to the monument in ways the pharaoh could not have anticipated. The forgetting happened anyway. It just happened more slowly. The philosopher Samuel Scheffler has written about what he calls the afterlife problem, which is not the religious question of personal survival, but the philosophical question of how much the continuation of the human project after our deaths matters to us, and why. His thought experiment is simple and disturbing. Suppose you knew that 30 days after your death, the earth and all its inhabitants would be destroyed. Not before your death, which might produce a different set of responses. After it, in a future you will not experience. Scheffler's observation is that this knowledge would devastate most people's sense of the meaningfulness of their projects, in a way that the mere knowledge of their own death does not. The work that was being done, the relationships that were being built, the things that were being created would feel drained of purpose, not because the personal experience of them would change, but because the implicit assumption that the work would persist, that others would encounter it and build on it and be affected by it, turns out to be essential to why the work felt worth doing. Most people do not consciously think of their work as being done for future generations who will remember them, but they unconsciously assume that the frame in which the work exists will continue after they do. The painter who finishes a canvas is not thinking about the centuries that the canvas may or may not survive, but the canvas being finished and hung and seen by someone is part of what makes the finishing feel meaningful. The work points outward into a world that will continue to receive it. The pointing requires a world that continues. The awareness that the world continues, but that the pointing eventually stops, is one version of the work that doesn't remember you. The work persists. The connection between the work and the person who made it attenuates. The painting outlives the painter, and eventually loses the context that made the painter intelligible to the people viewing it, and eventually the painting itself is lost, or destroyed, or simply ceases to be seen, and eventually there is no one for whom the painter is a name attached to anything at all. This process takes different amounts of time for different work. It takes centuries for the rare work that achieves the status of a cultural monument. It takes decades for the work that achieves modest, lasting recognition. It takes years or less for most of what most people produce in the course of their working lives. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was also a philosopher, returned to this territory repeatedly in his private notebooks, writing to himself rather than to an audience, in a voice that was honest about the impermanence in a way that the public voice rarely could be. He noted that many of the people who were famous in his time would be forgotten within a generation, and that many of those who had been famous before his time were already forgotten, and that his own fame, whatever its extent, would follow the same trajectory. He found in this not primarily a source of despair, but a kind of liberation. The work done in the full awareness of its impermanence is freed from the burden of justifying itself by its permanence. It can justify itself by its quality, its honesty, its genuine engagement with what it is attempting. The impermanence is not the negation of the meaning. It is the condition under which genuine meaning is possible, because genuine meaning does not require an infinite audience or an eternal record. There is a specific quality of grief that the awareness of being forgotten produces, different from the grief of death itself. The grief of death is the grief of ending. The grief of being forgotten is the grief of having been here and left no mark that holds, of having put effort and care and attention into things that the world received and moved past without the receiving leaving a permanent record, of having mattered to people who also eventually stopped mattering, and whose mattering too was therefore also temporary. The grief is recursive. It is not only that you will be forgotten. It is that the people who remember you will also be forgotten, and the people who remember them, until the chain of memory reaches back far enough that it simply stops, and there is no one left for whom any of it is still a living fact. Most human beings have come to terms with this in the ordinary way that human beings come to terms with things, which is by not thinking about it most of the time. The daily life provides adequate insulation. The work in progress requires attention that forecloses the long view. The relationships that make the work feel worthwhile are present and warm and immediate enough that the question of whether they will persist in the form of memory across generations does not intrude. The insulation is practical and necessary. The occasional breakthrough of the long view, the moments when the awareness of the impermanence is not managed but felt, is what this chapter is about. What tends to be discovered in those moments by people who sit with the awareness rather than immediately recovering the insulation is something that the insulation was not providing, and that the impermanence itself makes available. A quality of attention to the present that the assumption of permanence was quietly preventing. The work that knows it will not be remembered is freed to be whatever it actually is, rather than whatever it needs to be to justify the permanence it was hoping for. The relationship that knows it will end, not only with death, but with the forgetting that follows death, is freed to be fully itself in the time it has, rather than being managed for its legacy. The work does not remember you, but you were there when it was made, and the making was real in the way that only the present moment is real, which is the only way anything has ever been real, and which turns out, examined honestly, to be enough, not because it is everything that was hoped for, but because it is actually what was there, and you were in it, completely, for the time that it lasted. Chapter 12. The God-Shaped Silence. There is a before and an after. Not always marked by a single event, not always datable to a specific conversation or a specific reading, or a specific moment in which the framework that had organized everything suddenly failed to organize it. Sometimes the departure from belief is gradual, a slow loosening rather than a breaking, a series of small doubts that accumulated over years, without any one of them being sufficient to produce the crisis that the accumulation eventually produced. Sometimes it is sudden, a question that arrived with enough force to make the previous answers feel inadequate, in a way they had not felt before and could not recover from. Either way, there is a before in which the framework held, and an after in which it did not. And the after is what this chapter is about. The framework that religious belief provides is not only a set of propositions about the nature of reality, though it is that. It is a structure for understanding what has happened, and what is happening, and what will happen. A structure for understanding why suffering exists and what response to it is available. A structure for understanding the self, where it came from, and what it is for, and where it goes. A structure for understanding other people, how they are to be treated and what they are owed, and what their presence in the world means. A structure for the day itself, the morning and the evening and the week and the year and the entire span of a life, organized by practices and observances that give the temporal structure of existence a shape beyond the merely biological. When the framework goes, none of these structures are automatically replaced. The questions that the framework answered do not disappear. They remain exactly as they were, and the silence where the answers used to be is not a mutual absence. It is an active one. It has a quality, a specific weight. The person who has lost the belief does not simply find themselves in a condition of philosophical openness, available to explore the alternatives with the equanimity of someone who never had the framework in the first place. They find themselves in a condition where the place where the framework was is still shaped like the framework, and the shaping is felt, even though the framework is gone. This is what the God-shaped silence means. Not that God exists as a logical necessity derived from the feeling of absence. Not that the silence is evidence for anything about the nature of the universe. But that the human being who spent years or decades organizing their inner life around a particular framework, who developed their sense of self and their moral orientation and their relationship to suffering and death within the context of that framework, carries the shape of it long after the framework has been set aside. The silence is shaped. The emptiness has contours. And the contours are the exact contours of what was there. The philosopher Charles Taylor has written about what he calls the cross pressures of the secular age. The person who has left religious belief does not arrive at a stable secular alternative as a matter of course. They arrive at a condition of tension between the fullness that the belief provided and the sense that the belief is no longer available, and between the inadequacy of the secular alternatives to provide equivalent fullness and the inability to return to the belief that provided it. This is not, Taylor argues, simply a matter of intellectual error. The sense of fullness that religious experience provides is not an illusion generated by false belief. It corresponds to something real in human experience, some dimension of depth and connection and meaning that the secular alternatives have not, in their current forms, adequately replaced. What the person who has lost the framework discovers, and what makes the discovery so difficult to process, is that the secular world does not have a ready-made container for what they are now carrying. The grief of lost belief is not a grief that the secular culture has developed good resources for. The mourning for a God who is no longer believed in is a mourning that does not fit neatly into any of the available categories. It is not the mourning of bereavement, because nothing has died in the external world. It is not the grief of disillusionment, exactly, because the framework that was lost was not primarily an illusion, but a genuine organizing principle that provided genuine goods. It is its own kind of grief, specific to the experience of having been inside a total explanatory framework and then finding oneself outside it without having chosen another total explanatory framework to be inside. The people who have written most honestly about this experience tend to describe a period of genuine disorientation in which the practices that gave structure to daily life feel hollow without the belief that animated them, and the alternative practices that secular life offers feel thin in comparison to what they are replacing. The Sunday morning that was previously organized around a practice of communal meaning-making is now simply a Sunday morning. The rites of passage that marked the significant transitions of a life, the birth and the death and the marriage, now occur in contexts that acknowledge their significance, without providing the metaphysical framework that made the significance coherent. The self that understood itself as having a given nature and a given destination is now a self that understands itself as having to construct both of those things, and the construction is hard in ways that the givenness was not. And yet the after is also not only loss. The people who have moved through the disorientation and emerged on the other side, who have developed a way of living in the absence of the framework that is neither denial of the absence nor permanent grief about it, tend to describe something that is different from what they had before, but not simply impoverished by comparison. A quality of engagement with the present that the certainty of the framework sometimes prevented. A relationship to uncertainty that is more honest than the certainty was, even when the honesty is harder. A capacity to sit with the questions that the framework answered without needing the answers to be permanent, which is a capacity that the framework, by providing the answers, did not develop. The silence where the framework was is not empty in the way that a room is empty when furniture is removed. It is more like the silence in a piece of music, which is not the absence of music, but part of the music, which has its own quality and its own duration, and its own relationship to what came before and what will come after. The silence is part of the experience of the life that moved through the belief and beyond it. It is not something to be filled as quickly as possible with a replacement that performs the same function. It is something to be inhabited, in the same way that any genuine experience is inhabited, with the attention it deserves. The before had its gifts, the warmth of a community organized around shared meaning, the comfort of answers that held the largest questions in a stable configuration, the sense of being known by something that persisted beyond the knowing. These were real. The after has its own gifts, different ones, less warm in some ways and more honest in others. The capacity to be in the questions without needing them resolved. The discovery that meaning is available without a total explanatory framework to guarantee it. The specific quality of the relationship to the sacred that is possible for the person who can no longer take the sacred for granted. The silence is real, the shape it has is real, and the life that is lived inside the silence, attending to its specific quality rather than rushing to fill it, has something available in it, that the fullness was also, in its way, keeping quiet. Chapter 13. The routine that holds the dark back. There is an alarm that goes off at the same time every morning. The same time it went off yesterday, and the day before that. across a stretch of mornings that have blurred together into the specific way that routine mornings blur, where each individual morning is barely distinguishable from the others, but the sequence of them together has produced something that individual mornings cannot produce. A kind of stability. Not the stability of things being good, not necessarily, but the stability of things being what they were yesterday, which is a different and more modest and sometimes more important kind of stability than the other kind. The person who sets this alarm is not, in the mornings when it sounds, thinking about the philosophical status of their routine. They are making coffee in the way they always make coffee, moving through the kitchen in the order they always move through the kitchen, performing the sequence of small acts that constitutes the morning in a way that requires almost no active attention, which is part of the point. The active attention is being conserved. The day has not yet begun, and the active attention will be needed later, for things that will require it, and the routine is what allows the morning to happen without drawing on the reserve. The Romantic tradition and its inheritors in various forms of contemporary self-improvement culture has often positioned routine as the enemy of the examined life. The person who is fully alive in this tradition is the person who is present to each moment with fresh attention, who encounters the ordinary as though it were extraordinary, who does not allow the sediment of habit to obscure the vividness of experience. The routine is the symptom of a life being lived on autopilot, of an attention that has gone to sleep inside the repetition, of a self that has been replaced by its own habits and is no longer genuinely choosing anything because the choices have been preempted by the patterns. There is something real in this critique. The routine that is never examined, that proceeds without any awareness of what it is for or what it is protecting, can become a form of avoidance rather than a form of stability. The person who fills every moment with a scheduled activity, who arranges the day so tightly that no unstructured time exists in which the difficult questions could arise, is using structure differently from the person who uses structure as a foundation from which to engage with those questions. Both have routines. What the routines are doing is different. But the critique, when it becomes a general dismissal of the value of routine, misses something important about what structure provides and what its absence costs. The American philosopher and psychologist wrote about the value of habit with a directness that is still compelling. Habit, he argued, is the enormous flywheel of society, its most precious conservative agent. Not conservative in the political sense, but conservative in the sense of preserving energy. The habits that govern the routine parts of a life free the mind from having to make decisions about those parts, which means the decisions that matter, the choices that require genuine deliberation and genuine attention, can receive the attention that the routine parts of the life did not require. The routine is not the abdication of the examined life. It is what makes the examined life possible, by conserving the attention that examination requires. The psychologist Roy Baumeister developed the concept of eager depletion to describe the empirical observation that self-control and deliberate choice draw on a limited resource that is depleted by use. People who have made many decisions across a day make worse decisions at the end of it. Judges give less favorable rulings late in the session than early. The simple act of choosing, repeated across enough instances, produces a quality of cognitive fatigue that affects subsequent choices. The routine that removes the need to choose about certain things is not a retreat from agency. It is the conservation of agency for the things that require it most. But the deeper argument for routine is not the efficiency argument, though the efficiency argument is real. The deeper argument is about what the routine is doing for the person in the specific way that this chapter's title names. There are periods in a life when the dark is genuinely present, when the weight of existence presses down in ways that the philosophical account of what the weight is does not make lighter. The grief that is not finished, the depression that is not lifted, the anxiety that is not resolved, the specific quality of living in a period when the ordinary goods of life are not available to provide what they usually provide, when the meaning that is usually ambient in the daily activity has become thin and requires deliberate effort to locate. In these periods, the routine does something that nothing else does quite as well. It provides a sequence, a next thing. The person who has made it to the alarm and made it to the coffee and made it to the shower is, by the time they have made it to the door, further into the day than they were when the alarm sounded. Not because anything has been resolved, not because the dark has been addressed or argued with or enlightened, simply because the sequence has continued, and the continuing is itself a form of survival. The routine is the structure that makes it possible to get through a day that would otherwise have no shape except the shape of the weight. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote about the absurd hero as someone who continues to push the boulder up the hill in full awareness that it will roll back down. The continuation is the point. The pushing is what the life is. The routine, in its modest way, is a version of this. Not heroic in the dramatic sense, but persistent in the way that actual living requires persistence rather than drama. The person who makes the coffee and takes the walk and does the work and goes to sleep and sets the alarm again is doing something that looks from the outside like nothing. Because from the outside, it is nothing. Because from the outside, it is simply a Tuesday. But from the inside, it is the ongoing choosing of the next step, over and over, which is what the getting through looks like when it is actually happening. There is a specific tenderness that is owed to the person whose life looks, from the outside, like an unexamined series of routines. The person who does the same things at the same times, in the same ways, and whose life does not appear from the outside to be engaged in the kind of questioning that the examined life is supposed to involve. The tenderness is owed because the outside view does not have access to what the routine is holding, to what it is standing between the person and, to what the morning coffee and the evening walk and the same program on the same evening of the week are quietly preventing from moving from the background of the life into the foreground. The unexamined life is not worth living, the philosophical tradition says, but the person who is using all of their available attention simply to keep living is not living an unexamined life. They are living a life under examination, so continuous and so close that the routine is what allows anything else to happen at all. And the alarm that goes off tomorrow morning is not the symptom of a life gone to sleep. It is the choice, made again, to be there when it does. Chapter 14. The dread that arrived with knowledge. There is a version of ignorance that is not comfortable exactly, but is at least untroubled by the specific things that knowledge brings. The child who does not know the history of the century before their birth is not ignorant of a blessing. They are simply unaware of a particular category of human capability for cruelty, and the unawareness is not a failure. It is the appropriate condition of someone who has not yet encountered the record. The first encounter with the record, the first real engagement with what human beings have done to other human beings across the breadth of history, produces something that cannot be easily undone. The knowledge arrives, and the world from the inside becomes a different world. Not a world where different things are happening, but a world where what is happening is seen against a different background than it was before the knowledge arrived. The philosopher Blaise Pascal, writing in the 17th century, described the human situation with a directness that is still difficult to read without feeling the weight of it. "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me," he wrote, describing the specific dread that the new scientific understanding of the cosmos produced in him. Not fear of any specific thing in the cosmic expanse, fear of the silence, of the indifference, of the absence of any voice or presence that acknowledged the human project, that found the human fears and human loves and human works significant in the way that the humans experiencing them found them significant. The universe that science was revealing was not hostile to human beings. It was worse than hostile. It was uninterested. And the uninterest, to someone who had grown up inside a framework that described a universe profoundly interested in human affairs, was its own kind of horror. This dread is not the same as sadness, and not the same as anxiety, and not the same as depression, though it can produce all of these and can be confused with them. It is a specifically cognitive response to specifically acquired information, a response to knowing. The person who has not read the histories, who has not engaged seriously with the science, who has not followed the philosophical arguments to where they lead, does not have this dread in the same form. Their experience of the world may be difficult in many ways, but it is not difficult in this particular way, which is the way of a mind that has equipped itself with tools for understanding, and then used those tools to understand things that the equipping did not prepare it to hold. The historian and the scientist and the philosopher are professional holders of difficult knowledge. The historian who studies atrocity must develop a relationship to the record that allows them to continue doing the work without being destroyed by it. The scientist who works at the frontier of understanding, where the questions about the nature of matter and time and consciousness open onto the abyss rather than onto the comfortable, must find a way to inhabit the frontier without losing the capacity to function. The philosopher who follows the argument about meaning and value and the structure of existence to their honest conclusions must find a way to hold what the following reveals without being paralyzed by it. These are real skills, and they are developed over time, and they are not available simply through the decision to have them. They are earned through the sustained engagement with the difficult material that the discipline requires. But the dread does not only arrive through professional engagement. It arrives through the ordinary acquisition of knowledge that a thoughtful life involves. The person who reads widely, who engages seriously with history and science and philosophy and literature, accumulates over time a picture of the world that is more accurate than the picture available to someone who is engaged less seriously, and more accurate in specific ways that tend to make the picture heavier, more accurate about what human beings are capable of doing to each other, more accurate about the scale of the universe and the duration of time and the smallness of the human project against these backdrops, more accurate about the mechanisms that produce what is experienced as meaning and connection and value, which mechanisms, understood in their full detail, have a quality of contingency that the experience of meaning and connection and value did not suggest. The Roman philosopher Lucretius, writing 2,000 years before modern science had confirmed his intuitions about the nature of matter, arrived at something adjacent through pure reasoning. The world is made of atoms moving through void. The self is a temporary arrangement of atoms that will disperse. The gods do not intervene in human affairs. The fear of death is irrational, because death is simply the ending of the experience of the self, and the self that has ended cannot suffer from its ending. This was meant as a liberating account. Lucretius offered it as the cure for the dread rather than its source, but the medicine and the disease it was supposed to treat have a way of looking similar from the inside. And many of the readers of Lucretius, across centuries, have reported feeling something more like the dread than the liberation when the account fully landed. The philosopher John Stuart Mill, who had received one of the most rigorous intellectual educations of the 19th century, described in his autobiography a period of profound depression in his late 20s that he attributed in part to the specific quality of his knowledge. He had been trained to analyze everything, to understand the mechanisms behind every experience, to take apart the components of any feeling or belief and examine what they were made of. And the analysis had produced an understanding that was accurate and was also draining. The feeling of joy that analysis could produce by meeting one of its goals, he noted, was not accessible to him in the way it might have been to someone who had not analyzed it. The analysis had not made the joy false. It had made it harder to reach. The knowledge was between him and the experience in a way that the lack of knowledge would not have been. This is the specific form that dread takes in a mind that has equipped itself thoroughly, not the dread of a specific threat, the dread of the full picture, the dread that arrives not from what is unknown, but from what has been understood, which turns out to be more difficult to live with than the not understanding was. The ignorance that precedes knowledge has a quality of openness that the knowledge replaces with a quality of weight. The weight is more accurate. The accuracy is not a comfort. The weight of the accurate picture is heavier than the weight of the inaccurate one that the knowledge replaced. What tends to happen to people who develop a workable relationship with the dread that arrived with knowledge is not the elimination of the dread. The accurate picture does not become less accurate through familiarity. What changes is the relationship to the weight of it. The weight that was initially experienced as a threat, as something that would crush the capacity to live a meaningful life if it were fully acknowledged, gradually reveals itself to be something that can be carried, not effortlessly, not without its cost, but without the carrying being incompatible with the ordinary goods of the life that continues alongside it. The knowledge that the universe is indifferent does not prevent the warmth of a specific room on a specific evening. The knowledge of what human beings have done to each other does not prevent the specific quality of a specific friendship. The knowledge of the mechanisms behind experience does not prevent the experience. The picture is accurate, the accuracy is heavy, and the life that continues inside the accuracy is still, in the specific and particular and irreplaceable moments it contains, the only life available to be lived, which turns out to be, most of the time, more than enough. Chapter 15. The life that felt like someone else's. There is a specific and strange experience that most people have had at least once, usually briefly and usually without a name for it. You are doing something ordinary, walking through a familiar place, having a conversation you have had versions of before, performing a task that your hands know how to do without requiring your full attention. And then, without any transition you can identify, something shifts in the quality of the experience. The familiarity does not disappear, but it becomes distant. The place is still recognizable, but the recognition is coming from somewhere slightly removed from where you usually stand. You are watching yourself move through the experience rather than being inside the movement. The doing is happening, but the sense that you are the one doing it has loosened in some way that is difficult to describe precisely because the normal experience it is departing from is also difficult to describe, having been simply the normal experience rather than anything that required a description. This is the mild and transient version. It passes. The ordinary immersion in experience reasserts itself. The loosening was temporary, and the return to the familiar feeling of being yourself, going about your life happens without drama, usually noticed only in retrospect, if noticed at all. But the passage of the experience, however brief, leaves something behind, an awareness that the ordinary sense of being the continuous and unified author of one's experience is not as inevitable, or as solid as it seemed before the loosening occurred. It can be briefly absent, which means it can be absent, which means it is not the bedrock of experience, but something that is happening, something being maintained, which can under certain conditions temporarily cease to be maintained. The clinical term for the persistent version of this experience is depersonalization, and the term for the related experience in which the world, rather than the self, becomes distant and unreal is derealization. In their severe and persistent forms, these are genuinely disabling conditions that produce extraordinary suffering in the people who experience them, a suffering that is made worse by the difficulty of conveying the experience to people who have not had it. The person in the severe state is not simply describing a philosophical position about the nature of the self. They are describing an experience in which the ordinary sense of being a self, of inhabiting the experience from the inside, of being the author of one's own actions and the subject of one's own perceptions, has been severely disrupted. The philosophical position is arrived at through suffering rather than through reasoning. But the mild and transient version, which is genuinely common and not pathological, and the severe version, which is genuinely disabling and requires treatment, are both illuminating about the same underlying feature of experience. They reveal, through its temporary disruption, the degree to which the ordinary sense of being a unified self inhabiting a continuous life is an achievement rather than a given, a construction, something that is produced moment by moment through processes that are normally so reliable and so automatic that their operation is invisible, and that when those processes are disrupted, even briefly and mildly, what becomes visible is not only the disruption, but the construction that the disruption has interrupted. The psychologist and philosopher William James described the self as having multiple layers: the material self, which is the body and its extensions into the world; the social self, which is what other people see and respond to; the spiritual self, which is the innermost sense of a private subjectivity; and then, underlying all of these, what he called the pure ego, the sense of personal identity that connects the present moment to the past and the future, the thread of continuity that makes all the moments feel like they are happening to the same person. It is this pure ego, this sense of continuous personal identity, that depersonalization disrupts. The disruption is not of the other layers. The body continues, the social self continues, the experiences continue. What is disrupted is the felt sense of their continuous belonging to a single subject. What the disruption reveals is that this felt sense is produced, that it arises from processes that can fail, that it is not the simple, immediate given that it appears to be in the normal course of experience. The continuity of the self across time is in part a narrative construction, a story the mind tells about the relationship between past and present moments that makes them feel like the moments of a single ongoing life, rather than a series of discrete experiences that simply happen to be occurring in the same body. When the narrative construction is interrupted, when the story briefly fails to produce its normal effect, the moments have a different quality. They are present, but not owned, occurring, but not authored, real, but not quite mine. The Buddhist traditions have cultivated practices designed to produce something adjacent to this, though with a very different intentionality. The experience of the self as a construction, of the ordinary sense of being a unified subject as a product of mental activity, rather than a bedrock feature of reality, is, in these traditions, not something that happens accidentally and with distress, but something that is approached deliberately as the beginning of a different relationship to experience. The insight into the constructed nature of the self is not a symptom of disruption. It is the goal of a practice. The difference between the clinical experience of depersonalization and the meditative experience of anatta, the not-self, is not entirely in the content. Both involve a loosening of the ordinary identification with a fixed and continuous subject. The difference is in the relationship to the loosening. The clinical experience is unexpected, unwanted, and frightening. The meditative experience is cultivated, welcomed, and understood within a framework that makes it meaningful rather than threatening. The person who has experienced the mild version of depersonalization and who has sat with it honestly, rather than rushing to restore the ordinary sense of self, has been given something by the experience, however uncomfortable. Not a philosophical argument, an actual experience of what the philosophical argument is pointing at. The sense of being a continuous and unified self, inhabiting a continuous life, is real as an experience. It is not real as the simple given it usually presents itself as. It is produced, and the production, however reliable, is not the same as the ground. The distinction between the production and the ground is the distinction that the disruption briefly makes visible. The person who has felt the life feel like someone else's knows something that the person who has never had the experience can reason toward, but not quite reach. They know, not as a thought but as a felt fact, that the ordinary sense of ownership of one's experience is not identical to the experience itself. That the experience continues even when the ownership loosens. That there is something present in the experience that is not disrupted by the disruption of the self-sense. Something aware of the strangeness, present to it, not identical with the sense of self that has loosened. The observer of the observation whose presence was noted in the Mirror chapter earlier in this series. The life that felt like someone else's was still your life. The someone else that it felt like was also you, just seen from a different angle than usual. And what was seen from that angle? The machinery working without the manager present, the experience continuing without the owner, is the most honest view of the situation that the normal view, with its comfortable certainty of authorship, usually prevents. Chapter 16. The happiness that made things worse. There is a version of the story that ends with the getting. The years of working towards something, the sacrifices made, and the alternatives foregone, and the specific texture of the wanting that organized the days into something pointed and purposeful. And then the thing is gotten. The relationship that was hoped for begins. The achievement that was pursued arrives. The position that seemed like it would change everything is reached. And for a while, sometimes a long while, the getting does what the wanting promised it would do. There is satisfaction. There is relief. There is the specific quality of a desire met that provides a rest from the desire that was doing so much work for so long. And then something unexpected happens. The satisfaction does not persist in the form it arrived. The relief begins to have a ceiling. The days that were previously organized around the wanting have lost their organizing principle, without acquiring a new one. The life that was pointed at the thing is now in the thing, and being in the thing is different from pointing toward it, in a way that the pointing did not prepare for. The what now arrives before the what was been has been fully inhabited, and underneath the what now, if the person is honest and the quiet is sufficient, something else arrives, something that was not visible while the wanting was doing its work, something the wanting was keeping at bay. The ancient Stoics had a name for the phenomenon, or something close to it. They called it the hedonic treadmill, the tendency of human beings to return to a baseline level of contentment after any positive or negative change in their circumstances. The promotion that felt like it would change everything changes things for a while, and then becomes the new normal. And from the new normal, the view looks essentially similar to the view from the old normal, except that the ambition has moved to the next thing. The treadmill keeps moving. The position on it stays approximately the same. The feeling of having arrived, which the arrival provided, proves to be a temporary state rather than a permanent condition. This is the ordinary version of the phenomenon. It produces a kind of recurring disappointment that most people have experienced, and that most people address by redirecting the wanting toward the next thing, which will also not produce the permanent arrival that the wanting implied. The treadmill is uncomfortable but navigable. The discovery that the thing you wanted does not provide what the wanting promised is a discovery that most people incorporate into their understanding of how desire works without it producing a crisis. The version in which the arrival of the wanted thing does not simply fail to produce permanent satisfaction, but produces, in its failure to produce permanent satisfaction, a confrontation with a question that the wanting was specifically keeping off the table. While the wanting was active, while there was a clear object, and a clear purpose, and a clear reason why the current moment was not enough, the question of whether there is any point to any of this was not available in its full form. The wanting answered it by implication. The point was to get the thing. The getting would produce the satisfaction that would make the effort meaningful. The wanting was a temporary answer to the meaning question, a deferral of the question by filling the space where the question lives with the activity of pursual. When the getting arrives and the satisfaction does not persist, the deferral ends. The question that was deferred is now available in a form it was not previously available in. Not the question of whether the specific thing was worth wanting, which is a manageable question. The question of whether the whole structure, the wanting and the getting, and the next wanting and the next getting, is pointed toward anything. Whether there is a version of the arrival that is not subject to the treadmill. Whether the life organized around achieving things is a life organized around anything that will ultimately hold. The psychologist Abraham Maslow described a hierarchy of needs, in which the higher needs, the needs for self-actualization and meaning, and the expression of one's deepest capacities, only become visible after the lower needs have been met. His observation was that poverty and hunger and physical insecurity do not allow the luxury of the existential questions. The existential questions belong to people whose material situation is stable enough that the material questions are not dominant. In this sense, the arrival at the wanted thing, by meeting a need that was previously unmet, does not close the existential question. It opens it. The arrival is the clearing of the ground on which the deeper question, previously obscured by the urgency of the wanting, can now be stood in and seen. This is part of what makes the happiness that makes things worse so disorienting. The person in it is in a better external situation than they were before. The things that were wrong have been addressed. The things that were wanted have been gotten. The external conditions are more favorable by any objective measure, and the internal experience is, paradoxically, more difficult. The difficulty is not ingratitude. It is not a failure to appreciate what has been achieved. It is the specific difficulty that only becomes available when the lower order difficulties have been resolved. The clarity that the arrival provides is a clarity that allows the seeing of what was always there, waiting behind the urgency of the wanting. The philosopher Blaise Pascal, who keeps appearing in this series because his 17th century observations remain uncomfortably accurate, wrote about what he called diversion. The human being, aware of its own mortality and its own contingency, and the meaninglessness that threatens to be the bottom of everything, diverts itself from the awareness by keeping busy. The hunting is not for the hare. The hare would be a disappointment. The hunting is for the hunting. The activity is the refuge from the question, not the answer to it. Pascal's observation was not that diversion is always wrong. Sometimes the diversion is the only thing that keeps the awareness at a manageable distance. But the diversion that presents itself as the solution, that promises if you could just get the thing, then everything would be fine, is a diversion that eventually produces the very confrontation it was designed to prevent. The person who has gotten the thing and found that the getting has not resolved the question is in a difficult position that is also potentially a clarifying one. The structure that was supposed to provide the answer has been tested and found insufficient. The next thing that the treadmill offers has not yet been reached for. There is a space, uncomfortable and open, in which the question that was being deferred is now available to be sat with, rather than answered or avoided. What gets found in that space is different for different people. Some find the question genuinely unanswerable and develop a relationship to the unanswerability that is itself a kind of answer. Some find that the question sat with honestly, rather than answered quickly, opens into something that the years of wanting were moving through, rather than toward. Some find that the question was always the point, that the wanting was a form of the asking, and that the getting, by failing to answer it, has finally made the question itself visible enough to be engaged with directly. The happiness that made things worse, made them worse by making them honest, by removing the structure that was doing the answering, and leaving the question, standing alone in the cleared space that the getting finally produced. Chapter 17. The animal that knows there is a deer in a field. It is, by every available measure, fully present to what is happening around it. The grass, the light, the quality of the air that carries information the deer processes with a sophistication that no human instrument has yet fully replicated. When a predator is nearby, the deer experiences something that functions like fear, that produces in the body all the responses that fear produces, the elevated heart rate and the shift in attention and the preparation for flight. When the predator is gone, the deer returns to the grass, not to the memory of the fear, not to an anticipation of its return, to the grass, which is there now, which is what is available now, which is what the deer is capable of being with. This is not a failure of the deer's cognitive capacity. It is a feature of a different relationship to time than the one human beings have. The deer lives in what the present moment contains, not because it cannot learn from the past, which it can, but because the past does not persist in the deer's experience in the same way that it persists in a human being's experience. The deer that escaped a predator yesterday is wary in ways that reflect the learning. It is not haunted by the yesterday in ways that interfere with the today. The grass is the grass. The now is what is available. The deer is in it without the distance that knowing creates. The human being in the field is not in the field in the same way. The human being in the field is also in the memory of every other field they have been in, also in the anticipation of the field they will not be in, also in the awareness that the being in the field is temporary, that the person standing here will one day not be standing anywhere, that the light on the grass has a quality of beauty that is inseparable from the awareness that the perceiving of it will end. The grass is still grass, but it is grass apprehended by a mind that cannot be entirely present to it, because the being present to it is always accompanied by the knowing that the presence is happening, and the knowing that the presence is happening is also the knowing that the presence will end. Ernest Becker built an entire theory of human civilization on this observation. His argument, developed in The Denial of Death, was that the awareness of mortality is the central fact of human psychological life. Not as a conscious preoccupation, most people are not consciously thinking about their death most of the time, but as an underlying structure that shapes everything. The symbolic systems that human beings construct, the cultures and the religions and the ideologies and the achievements and the self-esteem projects that fill the ordinary life, are, at some level, responses to the knowledge of death. Attempts to create a sense of significance and permanence and meaning that can stand against the awareness of the self's finitude. The human animal is the animal that builds civilizations, because it is the animal that knows it will die, and cannot bear to know this without doing something in response to the knowing. This is a bleak account if it is read as only saying that human achievement is a defense mechanism. But Becker is more interesting than the bleak reading allows. His point is not that the symbolic systems are false, or that the achievements are merely anxious distractions. It is that they arise from the specific situation of the animal that knows. The knowing, while it produces the specific suffering that no other animal appears to produce, also produces everything else that is distinctively human. The art, and the philosophy, and the science, and the love that understands itself as love, rather than simply experiencing the behavioral response that love involves. All of it is downstream of the knowing. The knowing that produces human suffering is the same knowing that produces human meaning. This is the specific paradox of the animal that knows. The awareness of mortality that makes death frightening is the same awareness that makes the present moment available as a present moment, rather than simply as what is happening. The capacity to step outside immediate experience and observe it, which is what produces the distance and the alienation that the earlier chapters of this series have been describing, is also the capacity that makes genuine choice possible, that makes ethics possible, that makes the love that knows itself as love possible, rather than the instinctual attachment that is love without the knowing. The animal that suffers from knowing is also the animal that can do something with the knowing that the not knowing animal cannot do. The philosopher Albert Camus, who appears repeatedly in this series because he thought about these things with unusual directness, did not conclude from the human condition that the human condition is simply bad. He concluded that it is specific. The absurdity that arises from the collision between the human demand for meaning and the universe's silence in response is not a condition to be solved. It is the condition, and the response to it is not to pretend the silence is not silence, or to pretend the demand is not real. The response is to live fully inside the collision, to take the knowing seriously, and to take the living seriously simultaneously, to be the animal that knows, without letting the knowing prevent the being. The philosophical traditions that have spent the most time with this question tend to converge on a version of the same response, arriving at it from different directions. The Buddhist response to the awareness of impermanence is not to overcome the awareness, but to deepen it, to allow the impermanence to be fully seen, which paradoxically allows a more genuine presence to what is actually here, rather than a grasping at a permanence that is not actually here. The Stoic response to the knowledge of mortality is to use it deliberately, the practice of memento mori, the remembering of death, not as a morbid exercise, but as a means of clearing the attention of what does not matter and directing it toward what does. The existentialist response is to treat the awareness of finitude as the thing that makes authentic choice possible, because only the finite chooser is making real choices rather than running through the unlimited options of an unlimited life. What all of these traditions share is the refusal to treat the knowing as only a problem. The knowing is also an opening. The separation between human suffering and all other suffering in the natural world is real, and the separation is partly constituted by the degree to which human suffering is produced by the knowing, rather than by the immediate circumstances. The deer in the field does not suffer from the knowledge that the field will one day not be there. The human being in the field does. But the human being in the field can also see the field in a way the deer cannot, can see its beauty as beauty, rather than simply processing it as safe environment, can feel gratitude for the being in it, can experience the light on the grass as precious in a way that the deer's relationship to the grass does not produce. The curse and the gift are the same thing. The knowing that makes death frightening is the knowing that makes the field beautiful. The awareness that produces the existential dread is the awareness that makes the present moment available as something worth being in. The animal that knows suffers from knowing, and makes from that suffering every beautiful and terrible thing. Chapter 18. The story you tell to stay alive. There is something a person does that is so constant and so automatic that it doesn't usually register as an activity at all. It registers, when it registers, as simply the way things are. The activity is narration, the continuous, mostly unconscious telling of the story of who this person is, and what is happening to them, and why it matters, and where it is going. The story is not primarily told to others, though it is sometimes told to others. It is told to the self, by the self, in the ongoing internal commentary that accompanies every experience, and that connects the present moment to the past moments and the anticipated future moments in a way that makes the whole into something that has a shape. A protagonist, a trajectory, a reason for this moment to belong in the same sequence as all the other moments that preceded it. The narrative self is the philosopher Dan Dennett's term for what is being described here. The self in Dennett's account is not a fixed entity that exists prior to the narration. It is the narration. The story that the brain tells about its own processing, the interpretive layer that converts the flux of experience into something with a center and a continuity and a set of characteristic features that distinguish this person's story from any other person's story. The self is not the teller of the story. The self is what the telling produces. The author and the protagonist are the same thing, which is a strange kind of authorship, but it is the only kind available. This account is philosophically interesting, and also, on a bad Tuesday afternoon, utterly beside the point. Because what the person on the bad Tuesday afternoon knows is not that the self is the narrative product of ongoing self-interpretation. What they know is that the story has stopped making sense, that the pieces that were fitting together into something that had a direction and a meaning have stopped fitting, that the character in the middle of the story has lost the thread of what the story is about. And the loss of the thread is not a minor inconvenience. It is a specific kind of crisis that the ordinary language of crisis does not quite name. The psychologist Viktor Frankl observed, from inside the extreme situation of the concentration camp, that the capacity to maintain a meaningful narrative about one's own existence was closely correlated with the capacity to survive. The people who survived were not uniformly the strongest or the healthiest or the most well-resourced. They were, disproportionately, the people who had something to survive for, a relationship to return to, a work to complete, a meaning that extended beyond the immediate situation into a future that the person could hold in mind as worth reaching. The people who lost access to this forward-pointing meaning, who could not construct a story in which the surviving was pointed towards something, tended to lose the will to survive in a way that had measurable physical consequences. The narrative was not a luxury added on to the biological project of survival. It was part of the biological project of survival. The meaning was load-bearing. This was an extreme situation, and the conclusions drawn from it apply with different force to less extreme situations. But the underlying observation generalizes. The human being is an animal that requires a story about itself in order to function. Not a happy story necessarily, not a story in which everything is going well, but a story that has a shape, that has a character with recognizable features, that has some relationship between the present moment and a future moment that makes the present moment worth getting through. The depressed person who cannot get out of bed is not, in most cases, in a situation that is objectively impossible to navigate. They are in a situation in which the narrative has broken down in a specific way, in which the connection between the present moment and a future worth reaching for has become inaccessible. And the inaccessibility of that connection has made the present moment feel like a weight without a direction. The psychotherapeutic traditions, across their considerable differences, tend to converge on narrative as a central therapeutic concern. The person who comes to therapy is in most cases a person whose story has gone wrong in some specific way. It may have gone wrong because events occurred that the existing narrative could not accommodate. It may have gone wrong because the story being told was never accurate, was organized around a misunderstanding of what happened, or a self-concept that events have made untenable. It may have gone wrong simply because the forward motion of the story has stopped, because the future that the story was pointing toward has been lost or foreclosed. The therapy, in various ways depending on the approach, works with the narrative, helps the person find the places where the story has become stuck or distorted or false, helps them construct a version of the story that is more accurate, more livable, more capable of incorporating what has happened and pointing toward something that can still be pointed toward. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur spent much of his career thinking about narrative identity, the idea that the self is constituted through the stories it tells about itself across time. His observation was that the narrative is not merely retrospective. It does not only make sense of what has happened, it also shapes what happens next. Because the person who understands themselves as a particular kind of character in a particular kind of story will respond to events in ways that are shaped by the story they are inhabiting. The person who tells a story of resilience will respond to setbacks differently from the person who tells a story of victimhood, not because the setbacks are different, but because the story is different. The narrative is performative. It does not only describe the self, it produces it. This is both a source of possibility and a source of danger. The source of possibility is that the story can be changed, not instantly or without cost, but genuinely. The person who has been inhabiting a story of limitation can, through the hard work of recognizing the story as a story, develop a different one. The source of danger is that the stories that are most easily changed are not always the stories that most need changing. The comfortable story, the story that flatters the teller and explains everything in ways that require no revision of the self, is easier to maintain than the honest story, which is harder to tell and more demanding to inhabit. The story you tell to stay alive is not an optional supplement to the life. It is what the life is from the inside. The events occur. The narrative makes them into something. And the something they are made into shapes everything that follows, shapes the responses and the choices and the relationship to what is coming, which will itself be made into something by the narrative that receives it. The story is not just what you tell. It is what you are while you are telling it. And the moments when it breaks, when the thread is lost, when the character has no idea what they are doing in this scene or what scene is supposed to come next, are not the moments when the story ends. They are the moments when a new chapter struggles to find its first sentence. Chapter 19. The Philosopher Who Smiled Anyway. There is a painting of Democritus laughing, the philosopher who, 2,500 years ago, proposed that everything in the universe is made of atoms moving through void, that the gods do not intervene in human affairs, that the soul is material and mortal and ends with the body, is depicted in this painting not with the expression that such conclusions might be expected to produce, not with the specific weight that has been described across this series as the appropriate response to genuinely difficult knowledge. He is laughing by some accounts at the human comedy of creatures who take seriously things that his analysis had revealed to be, at the scale of atoms and void, not quite as serious as they appeared. The laughter was not cruel. It was, by the accounts that survive, something more like the laughter of someone who has seen through a particular kind of pretension and found the seeing through genuinely funny rather than only devastating. He was called the laughing philosopher. His contemporary Heraclitus, who proposed a different but equally unsettling view of the nature of reality, was called the weeping philosopher. The contrast is itself a kind of philosophical statement. The same honest engagement with the nature of things produced in these two figures responses at opposite emotional poles. The same difficult knowledge was compatible with laughter. The same void that produced the weeping also contained room for the other thing. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius is not usually described as a smiling figure. He was an emperor who spent much of his reign on military campaigns he did not want, managing an empire he had not chosen to be responsible for, writing in private notebooks a philosophy of acceptance that he clearly needed to write because the acceptance did not come naturally, but required continuous practice. His meditations are not a record of equanimity achieved. They are a record of equanimity worked toward, daily, in the full awareness of everything that made equanimity difficult. He wrote about death with frequency and without evasion. He wrote about the smallness of human affairs against the scale of time and the indifference of the universe. He wrote about the way fame and recognition dissolve, quickly, after the person who was recognized is gone, and he was not broken by this knowledge. The meditations are not the work of a broken person. They are the work of someone who found, through the sustained engagement with difficult things, a quality of relationship to the situation that was not happiness in the ordinary sense, but was something more durable than ordinary happiness. Something that did not require the situation to be good in order to be sustained. The word the Stoics used for it was eudaimonia, which is translated as happiness, but means something closer to flourishing, to the specific quality of a life that is being lived well from the inside, regardless of the external circumstances that surround it. Baruch Spinoza worked in near poverty, grinding lenses to survive, while developing one of the most comprehensive and demanding philosophical systems in the Western tradition. He was excommunicated from his community at 23, one of the most severe excommunications on record, for views that were not entirely clear to the people issuing it, but were clearly threatening to their framework. He lived quietly after that, declining prestigious academic positions that would have compromised his independence, writing in the knowledge that his most important work could not be published in his lifetime. His philosophy arrived at a view of the universe as a single, infinite substance, of which everything is a mode, a view in which the human being is a temporary and partial expression of something that has no analog in ordinary religious categories, neither the God who intervenes and cares about human affairs, nor the indifferent universe of Democritus, but something that contains and produces everything without being separate from anything. This view was later described by some as the God-intoxicated philosophy, not because Spinoza was conventionally religious, which he clearly was not, but because the total immersion in the infinite whole that his philosophy produced in its author had a quality more often associated with mystical experience than with philosophical argument. The person who understands themselves as a mode of the infinite whole, who grasps the necessity of everything that occurs as part of a single connected system, who achieves what Spinoza called the intellectual love of God, the amor intellectualis Dei, does not achieve freedom from the things that happen. They achieve a different relationship to the things that happen, one in which the resistance that produces the suffering is replaced by something more like understanding, which produces something that Spinoza, in characteristically rigorous and unsentimental language, called blessedness. Camus is the obvious figure in this context, the philosopher who insisted on the absurd without resolution, who refused the leap of faith that would have made the absurd meaningful, on borrowed terms, who held the collision between the human demand for meaning and the universe's silence without resolving it in either direction, is also the philosopher who wrote with more genuine warmth and more genuine love of the physical world than most of his contemporaries. His descriptions of the Algerian sun, of swimming in the Mediterranean, of the ordinary pleasures of embodied life, are not the descriptions of a person who has been hollowed out by the honest engagement with meaninglessness. They are the descriptions of someone for whom the honest engagement with meaninglessness has made the available pleasures more specific and more valued rather than less. The smile that survives the void is not the smile of someone who has found that the void is not there. It is not the smile of the person who has found a way to look away. It is the smile of the person who looked directly and found after the looking that something remained. Not the framework that preceded the looking, not the comfortable certainties that the honest engagement dissolved, but something else, something that was available on the other side of the dissolution that was not available before it. A quality of relationship to what is actually here rather than what was hoped for. A specific and undefended appreciation for the things that are present, rather than an anxious grasping at the things that the honest account has revealed to be absent. Friedrich Nietzsche, who also appears repeatedly in this series, spent much of his philosophical career dismantling the frameworks that had been providing the answers to the questions he was asking. God as a source of ultimate meaning, morality as a fixed and divinely grounded structure, the self as a simple and unified subject of experience. He dismantled these with a ferocity that suggested someone who needed them to be gone, who found them intolerable rather than simply false. And yet his philosophy was not organized around the absence of what the dismantling removed. It was organized around what he called the affirmation, the yes that could be said to life in its full difficulty, without the support of the frameworks that had previously been doing some of the yes-saying. The person who could say yes without the frameworks was, for Nietzsche, the figure he admired most. The person who could laugh at the human comedy without the laughter being cruel, who could be in the void without the void being the final word. The smile is not easy. It is not the default. The default for many people who genuinely engage with the difficult knowledge this series has been describing is closer to the weight that the earlier chapters have been honest about. The weight is appropriate. The knowledge is genuinely heavy. But the smile is also available, not always and not automatically, as a destination that certain people have reached through the sustained engagement with the difficulty rather than around it. A destination that is not the absence of the difficulty, but a different relationship to it, one in which the void is seen clearly, and the life is lived fully, and the two of these somehow coexist, more peacefully than expected. Chapter 20. The dread that protects you. There is a version of the absence of dread that looks, from the outside, like peace. The person who moves through their days without the specific weight that this series has been describing, without the 3 a.m. confrontations, without the awareness of the smallness and the impermanence and the questions that have no clean answers, can appear to be someone who has achieved a kind of equanimity that the dread-prone person is still working toward. They are comfortable. They are not troubled. The mornings are ordinary in an ordinary way, rather than ordinary in a way that briefly reveals the strangeness underneath the ordinary. They have what looks like peace from the outside and what they themselves experience as simply life, proceeding in the way that life proceeds when it is not being examined too closely. But the peace that comes from not examining is not the same thing as the peace that comes from having examined and arrived somewhere. The equanimity of the person who has genuinely sat with the difficult questions and developed a workable relationship to them is different in kind from the equanimity of the person who has not sat with them at all. Both look calm from the outside. From the inside, they are organized differently. One is a stability that has been tested. The other is a stability that has not yet been tested, which is not the same kind of stability, even if it produces similar behavior in ordinary circumstances. The dread is a signal. This is the central claim of this chapter, and it is worth taking seriously rather than setting aside as a rationalization of discomfort. The dread that arrives in the quiet hours, the weight of the awareness of impermanence and contingency, and the absence of guaranteed meaning, is not only a source of suffering, it is information. It is the registration in the body and in the emotional life of things that are genuinely true about the situation. The impermanence is real. The contingency is real. The absence of a guaranteed meaning is real. The dread is what it feels like to be in genuine contact with these realities rather than insulated from them by the distractions and the frameworks and the ordinary busyness that the daily life provides. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, who wrote about anxiety with a depth that clinical psychology has not fully matched, distinguished between fear and anxiety in a way that bears repeating in this context. Fear is directional. It is afraid of something specific: the dog, the diagnosis, the difficult conversation. Fear can be addressed by addressing its object. If the object is removed or the threat is resolved, the fear resolves with it. Anxiety is different. It has no specific object. It is not afraid of any particular thing in the world, or, rather, it is the response of a consciousness to the full weight of its own situation, to the groundlessness that the ordinary busyness is constantly covering. When the busyness stops and the silence arrives, What arrives with the silence is anxiety, and the anxiety in Heidegger's account is not a malfunction to be corrected. It is the authentic mood, the mood in which the self is most honestly in contact with the nature of its situation. The person who never experiences this anxiety is not on this account in a better situation than the person who does. They are in a more insulated situation. The insulation is comfortable and has real advantages, but comfort is not the same as honesty, and insulation is not the same as resolution. The person who has not felt the weight of the groundlessness has not resolved the groundlessness. They have simply not yet been in contact with it directly. And there are situations in life, encounters with loss or mortality or the failure of a framework that was providing the insulation, that bring the contact into being, whether the person has sought it or not. The contact that arrives unbidden and unexpected is harder to metabolize than the contact that has been developed over time through the voluntary engagement with the difficult questions. This is the specific protection that the dread provides, not protection from anything external, protection from the specific vulnerability of a person who has never developed a relationship with the groundlessness because the insulation has always been sufficient. The person who knows the dread, who has sat with it across the hours and the years, who has developed a familiarity with its quality and some capacity to remain in it without being destroyed by it, is less vulnerable to its catastrophic arrival in the moments when the insulation fails. Not invulnerable. Nothing about this produces invulnerability, but less catastrophically unprepared. There is another version of the protection that the dread provides, which is less about resilience and more about attention. The person in genuine contact with the impermanence of what is here is in a different relationship to what is here than the person for whom the impermanence is not a felt reality. The meal that will not always be available, eaten by someone who knows this not as a fact, but as a felt truth, has a quality that the meal eaten in the full insulation from impermanence does not quite have. The conversation with the person who will not always be there, had by someone who is genuinely aware of this, has a specific quality of presence that the same conversation held in the assumption of permanence does not produce. This is the mechanism behind many contemplative practices across traditions. The memento mori of the Stoics, the Buddhist meditation on impermanence, the Sufi practices of consciousness of death, all of these are deliberate cultivations of the awareness that the ordinary life keeps insulated. The cultivation is uncomfortable. The practices are not pursued because they produce pleasant states. They are pursued because the awareness they produce, while uncomfortable, also produces a quality of engagement with the present that the insulation prevents. The person who genuinely feels the transience of the present moment is more available to the present moment than the person who is insulated from the transience. The dread, or what these traditions deliberately cultivate, which functions similarly, is the price of the availability. The miracle that the dread is paying attention to is not a theological claim. It is simply the observation that the situation, examined honestly, is extraordinary. The specific arrangement of matter and time and circumstance that produced a conscious being who can be aware of its own situation is not something that the universe was required to produce. It was not inevitable. The vast majority of the possible arrangements of matter do not produce anything that can be aware of anything. The specific arrangement that produced you, that produced the capacity to be in this moment and to feel the weight of the dread that accompanies the awareness of this moment, is extraordinary, in the simple sense of being enormously unlikely and enormously specific. The dread is what it feels like to be genuinely aware of how specific this is, to have not gone numb to the fact that there is something here rather than nothing, that the nothing, which is the vast majority of what is possible, did not obtain, and that what obtained instead is this, which is temporary and contingent and uncertain, and also, if you are paying attention, worth having been here for. Chapter 21. The ordinary moment that suddenly glowed. There is a cup of coffee sitting on a table. It has been sitting on tables like this, in the ordinary way that coffee sits on tables, for as long as you have been drinking coffee. There is nothing remarkable about it. The ceramic is a color that has been looked at enough times to have stopped being noticed. The steam rises in the same way it always rises. The smell, which is the smell of coffee, is the smell of every other cup of coffee in the memory, and does not require any particular noticing. This is an ordinary cup of coffee at an ordinary table, in a morning that is proceeding in the way that ordinary mornings proceed. And then, briefly and without warning, it is not ordinary. Something shifts in the quality of the attention, and the cup of coffee, the specific and unrepeatable cup of coffee that exists at this particular moment in this particular morning, becomes visible in a way it was not visible a moment before. The steam has a specific quality that is this steam and not any other steam. The warmth that the hands feel through the ceramic is specific warmth, this warmth, present now and not in any other moment. The smell that was the generic smell of coffee is now a specific smell, occurring in a specific nose, connected to a specific web of memory and association that no other nose has and that will not be available when the nose is gone. The cup of coffee is here, and the herness of it, the specificity and the presence, and the fact of its being exactly this rather than any other thing, is for a moment fully available, and then it is not. The ordinary reasserts itself. The cup is again the cup. The morning is again the morning. The specific glow that the moment briefly had does not persist, which is part of what makes it a glow rather than simply the normal quality of things. The normal quality of things is not glowing. The glow is the exception. The exception is what this chapter is about. The philosopher William James described religious and mystical experiences in terms of a noetic quality, a sense of knowledge or revelation that accompanies them. The person having the experience does not only feel something unusual, they feel that they have seen something true, something that was always the case, but that the ordinary perception was not accessing. The glow in its secular version has something of this quality. The cup of coffee that suddenly glows is not a cup of coffee that has acquired properties it did not previously have. It is a cup of coffee being seen as it actually is, in its specificity and its presence, rather than as the generic category it is normally processed as. The Japanese aesthetic concept of wabi-sabi is the closest cultural approximation in any tradition to what the glow produces and why. Wabi-sabi finds beauty in the imperfect and the impermanent and the incomplete. The tea bowl with the crack, the garden that has been touched by weather, the face that shows its years. Not beauty in spite of these things, but beauty that is inseparable from these things. Beauty that requires the imperfection and the impermanence to be what it is. The crack in the bowl is not a flaw to be overlooked. It is where the beauty lives. The transience of the cherry blossom is not a diminishment of its beauty. It is the source of the beauty's specific quality, the reason the beauty has the weight it has. The glow that descends on the cup of coffee is a wabi-sabi experience. It is the perception of the cup as impermanent, as temporary, as existing in this moment and no other moment, that gives the cup the quality it briefly has. The impermanence is not registered as a loss. It is registered as what makes the present presence of the cup significant. A cup that will not always be here, perceived by someone who will not always be here, in a morning that will not come again, has a weight that the permanent cup in the permanent morning would not have. The weight is the duty. The transience is what produces the glow. This experience, which is accessible across a wide range of human beings in a wide range of circumstances, tends to arrive in specific conditions. It arrives most often after a period of confronting something difficult, after an encounter with mortality, either one's own or someone close, after a period of genuine engagement with the questions this series has been working through, the questions about meaning and impermanence and the absence of a guaranteed framework, after an illness or a loss or a period of the specific dread that the previous chapter described as the signal that real attention is operating. The glow tends to follow the darkness, not as a reward for having been in the darkness, but as a consequence of what the darkness does to the perception. What the darkness does is thin the insulation, the ordinary insulation that keeps the impermanence at a manageable distance, that allows the cup of coffee to be processed as a category rather than encountered as a specific and unrepeatable presence, is temporarily removed by the confrontation with the difficult things. And in the thinning of the insulation, the perception is briefly available to what is actually here in the way it usually is not. The cup is briefly seen rather than processed. The morning is briefly present rather than passed through. The experience is briefly experienced rather than added to the accumulation of experiences that constitute the ordinary day. The writer and physician Paul Kalanithi, writing in the period between his terminal cancer diagnosis and his death, described the changed quality of his engagement with ordinary experience in terms that this chapter has been approaching. The things that he had been too busy to notice, the specific quality of his daughter's face, the light in the late afternoon, the texture of the conversations that the previous busyness had made unavailable for genuine attention, became available in a way that the busyness had prevented. Not because the cancer was good, not because the confrontation with death is something to be sought for its effects, but because the confrontation had done something to the quality of his attention that the ordinary life had not done, and that the ordinary life, by itself, was unlikely to have done. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, the deliberate imagining of the loss of what is present, is an attempt to produce the glow without waiting for the darkness that naturally produces it. To encounter the cup of coffee as though it might not be there, as though the morning in which it appears is one of a finite number of mornings, rather than one of an apparently infinite supply. The practice is deliberate and feels artificial compared to the glow that arrives unbidden, but it is aimed at the same quality of perception, the specific appreciation for the present that the awareness of impermanence produces. The glow does not last. This is not a failure of the glow. The glow that lasted would not be a glow. It would simply be the new normal quality of perception, which would then itself become invisible in the way that all normal qualities of perception become invisible. The glow requires the contrast. It requires the ordinary from which it briefly departs and to which it returns. The return is not a loss. It is what allows the next departure to be a departure. The cup of coffee on the table is ordinary, and it is, in the moments when the insulation thins and the perception is briefly available, exactly enough. Not because the dread has been resolved, but because the dread, for a moment, cleared the way for seeing what was always there in the specific and unrepeatable morning. That is this morning, and no other. Chapter 22. The other people who felt this. There is a woman in ancient Rome lying awake in the dark. The city is quiet in the way that ancient cities are quiet at night, which is not entirely quiet, but quieter than the day. And the quiet is sufficient for the thoughts that the day's activity was keeping at bay to arrive with their full weight. She is thinking about her son who died 2 years ago. She is thinking about the empire that will not last, though she may not know this, and about the specific quality of the season changing outside the window, and about the fact that the season changing is something she has experienced before and will experience again until she will not, and about the specific terror and the specific beauty of this, which are not separable from each other in the way that she would prefer them to be. She is a specific person with a specific life and a specific grief and a specific fear. She is also every person who has lain awake in the dark thinking these thoughts in every century of recorded human history and in all the centuries before the history was recorded. What this woman knew, and what the person lying awake in the dark in the present moment does not always know, is that she was not alone in the specific way that the 3 a.m. feeling convinces you that you are alone. The feeling produces a particular quality of isolation. The conviction that what is being felt is too strange or too dark or too difficult to be shared, that the other people who are asleep at this hour are asleep because they do not have this thing inside them, that the wakefulness is itself evidence of something wrong with the person who is awake. The feeling is private in a way that feels unique, but the uniqueness is an illusion produced by the darkness and the hour and the absence of the others who are elsewhere in the dark, having the same feeling and also believing it is uniquely theirs. The Psalms are among the oldest pieces of human writing that have survived with anything like their original emotional content intact. They are, a significant number of them, records of exactly the feeling this series has been describing: the sense of abandonment in the darkness, the question of whether the structure that was supposed to hold everything has held, the specific quality of suffering that comes not from any single specific cause, but from the weight of being conscious and mortal and uncertain. The Psalms are not philosophy. They are not argument. They are the record of someone lying awake in the dark, feeling what is felt in the dark, and finding that the finding of words for it is itself a form of not being entirely alone in it. In their books of the dead, and in their tomb inscriptions, and in the private documents that have survived to be read across 4,000 years of subsequent history, show a relationship to mortality and impermanence and the questions underneath the ordinary life that is recognizable from inside the present moment. They worried about being forgotten. They worried about whether the life they had lived had been sufficient. They worried about the judgment that would come after, and about the quality of the life they had managed to build from the materials available to them, and about whether the love they had given and received had been enough. The specific frameworks in which they held these worries were different from any currently available. The worries were the same. The Tang Dynasty poets of 8th century China wrote about the moon with a regularity that their translators have sometimes found excessive, until the reason for the frequency becomes clear. The moon was a shared object. It was visible from everywhere. It was the same moon that was visible to the person you loved who was somewhere else, and to the ancestor who had watched it before you. and to the stranger in another province who was also awake and also looking at it, and also feeling the specific quality of the night and its questions. The moon was the connection across the isolation, the proof that the feeling was shared even when no sharing was possible, across the distances that separated the people doing the feeling. The person writing the poem about the moon was saying, I am here in this feeling, and you are there in this feeling, and the moon connects us across the separation. Montaigne, writing his essays in the 16th century from a tower in the French countryside, developed what is perhaps the most direct and most personal expression of the project that this series is engaged with. He wrote about himself, not as a model or an exemplar or a representative of universal human nature, though he became all of these by accident, but as a specific person trying to understand what was happening inside him, and finding that the attempt to understand was worthwhile in itself, regardless of whether the understanding produced conclusions. He wrote about his fear of death and his relationship to his own body and his thoughts in the night, and the way his mind moved when it was left to itself. He wrote about what it was like to be a person. He did this because he was curious about what it was like to be a person, and he had the most direct access to the data of one particular person, which was himself. He did not expect to be read 400 years later by people for whom the specifics of 16th century France were remote, and the experience of lying awake in the dark with the questions was not remote at all. The Japanese poet Basho walked alone through Japan in the 17th century, writing haiku about what he saw and felt. The haiku are small in their form and enormous in what they contain. A frog jumping into an old pond, the sound of the water, the loneliness of autumn. These are not philosophical positions. They are specific moments of perception, recorded with the specific quality of someone paying full attention to the specific thing in front of them, because the specific thing in front of them is what is actually there, and everything else is abstraction. He was lonely in a way that the form of his life produced, and he did not try to resolve the loneliness. He tried to see it clearly and to record what the seeing looked like. The clarity is still available to be received. The letter writers who have survived, whose private correspondences have been preserved by accident or by design across centuries, are among the most direct connections available to the person in the present moment, to the specific texture of the same feeling in a different time. The Roman statesman Cicero, writing to his friend Atticus about the death of his daughter, in letters that make no attempt to perform the appropriate Stoic response, and simply describe what the grief is like from inside. The medieval abbess Hildegard of Bingen, writing about her visions and her doubts and the specific quality of the darkness that preceded the visions. The English poet John Keats, writing his letters in the last years of his life, aware that he was dying young, describing the beauty of the world with a specificity that the awareness of departure made possible. All of them in the dark, all of them with the weight. All of them, in the act of writing, finding that the weight could be carried if not resolved, that the finding of words for it was itself a form of carrying. This is what the long record shows. Not that the feeling was resolved by any of them, not that any of the frameworks produced for managing it turned out to be the final framework, but that the people who felt it, across the full breadth of the human record, mostly continued, mostly found a way to carry what could not be put down, mostly discovered that the carrying, while not the same as comfort, was possible, and that the carrying was sometimes in specific moments accompanied by the glow that the previous chapter described, the specific and unrepeatable perception of what is actually here, made available by the confrontation with what will not always be here. The woman in ancient Rome eventually slept. The Tang Dynasty poet eventually set down the brush. Montaigne eventually closed his book. Keats eventually stopped writing letters. Each of them returned at some point to the ordinary, not because the questions were answered, because the night had a limit and the morning came, and the morning required its own attending to. The morning will come for you too. It always has. And in the dark before it arrives, you are not the first person to be lying here, with this, not even close to the first, and most of them carried it all the way to morning. Chapter 23. The Absurd and the Smile It Demands. There is a man pushing a boulder up a hill. He has been doing this for a very long time. Long enough that the pushing has become the entire content of his life, the thing that defines him, the activity in which all his effort and attention are permanently invested. The hill is always the same hill. The boulder is always the same boulder. The pushing requires everything he has and produces at the top the same result every time. The boulder rolls back down, and the man goes back to the bottom. and the pushing begins again. This is the story that the ancient Greeks told as a punishment. The specific torture of Sisyphus was designed to be intolerable because it was designed to be endless and pointless. The effort that produces nothing, the cycle that has no culmination, the labor that is its own undoing, over and over across eternity. The Greeks understood something about human nature when they designed this particular hell. They understood that what the human being finds most unbearable is not effort or pain, but futility. The effort that goes nowhere, the meaning that cannot be found. Albert Camus took this story and did something with it that the Greeks did not intend, and that when it is fully understood, shifts the entire weight of the story from its context as punishment to something else entirely. He said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not that Sisyphus has found a trick to avoid the suffering. Not that the boulder has been permanently fixed at the top of the hill. Not that the pushing has been revealed to be pointing towards something other than what it appears to be pointing toward. The boulder still rolls back down. The return to the bottom is still required. The futility is still fully present and fully acknowledged. We must imagine Sisyphus happy, despite all of this. Or rather, Camus suggests, happy because of the specific quality of his relationship to all of this. Not in spite of the absurd situation, but from inside it, having looked at it directly and chosen to be fully in it, rather than looking away from it, or pretending it is something other than what it is. The absurd in Camus's philosophy is not a conclusion about the nature of reality. It is a relationship. It is what arises in the collision between two things that are both real and both non-negotiable. The human demand for meaning, which is constitutive of human consciousness, which cannot be switched off without ceasing to be the kind of consciousness that is making the demand. And the universe's silence in response to that demand, the refusal of the world to confirm that the demand is being heard, or that the answer is forthcoming, or that the effort is being registered by anything that will eventually provide the completion that the demand was asking for. The collision between these two things which cannot be resolved in either direction is the absurd. It is not the tragedy. It is the condition. Camus proposed three possible responses to the absurd. Physical suicide, which he considered and rejected as the wrong response, not because life is guaranteed to be worth living, but because the act of ending the life in response to the absurd is a concession that the absurd won, that it had the final word, that the silence of the universe was the most important fact about the situation. Philosophical suicide, which he also considered and rejected, is the move that most people make without recognizing it as the move it is. It is the leap into a framework that provides the answer the demand was asking for. The religious leap, the ideological leap, any leap that answers the demand by providing a context in which the demand is met, and the absurd is therefore resolved. Camus did not deny that these frameworks provide comfort or that the comfort is real. He insisted that they resolve the absurd by ceasing to look at it honestly. The answer is purchased at the cost of the seeing. The third response is revolt, to remain in the collision, to acknowledge the demand and acknowledge the silence, and to continue pushing the boulder in full awareness that the boulder will roll back down, not despite the knowledge, but with it. The revolt is not dramatic. It is not a raised fist up a sky. It is the returning to the bottom with a particular quality of relationship to the returning. A relationship in which the situation is fully seen and fully accepted as the situation, without the acceptance being the same as surrender. Acceptance and surrender are not the same thing. Acceptance is the honest acknowledgement of what is the case. Surrender is the giving up of the engagement with what is the case. Camus's Sisyphus accepts without surrendering, continues without being deceived, pushes without expecting the arrival. The smile that the absurd demands is this, not a performance of happiness, not the forced optimism of someone who has decided to look on the bright side as a coping mechanism. The smile that survives the honest confrontation with the absurd is the smile of someone who has looked at the situation completely and found in the complete looking something that the partial looking was not providing. Something that is not the resolution of the absurd, but the specific freedom that exists inside it. The freedom is real. It is the freedom of having nothing to lose that has not already been acknowledged as lost. The person who has fully accepted the absurdity of the project, who has given up the demand that the project be guaranteed to mean something in a way that the universe will confirm. It's free to push the boulder with a different kind of investment than the person who is still waiting for the confirmation. The pushing becomes the thing itself, rather than the means to something else. The effort is not in service of the arrival. The effort is what the engagement looks like. The rocks have a texture that Sisyphus knows in the way that only someone who has carried a thing many times can know it. The hill has a quality in different weather and at different times of day that varies in ways that someone who has been walking it for eternity has noticed. The descent, which is the part that the myth tends to overlook as simply the return to the beginning, is the part that Camus finds most interesting. The descent is the time that belongs entirely to Sisyphus. The boulder has already rolled. Nothing is required of him on the way down except the walking. And the walking, done by someone who is fully present to the situation and who has given up the demand that the situation be something other than what it is, has a quality that the distracted or the deceived walker does not have access to. There is a specific quality of living that becomes available on the other side of the absurd's honest acknowledgement. The previous chapter described how the thinkers who stared longest into the void sometimes emerged with something other than despair. The previous chapter described it as a smile. What this chapter has been describing is the mechanism of that smile. It is not the smile of someone who found the answer. It is the smile of someone who stopped meeting the answer in the form they have been demanding it. Who found that the pushing, done with full attention and without illusion, was itself enough of a thing. Who found that the boulder rolling back down was not only defeat, but also the provision of the next morning's work, which was the thing they were doing, which was the thing they were. The myth is usually read as a story about futility. Camus proposes that it is a story about something else, about what happens when a person stops fighting the condition of their existence and starts inhabiting it instead, fully, clearly, without the comfort of the resolved absurd, and discovers in the inhabiting something that the fighting was preventing them from finding, which is not the answer, but is something that turns out to sit more comfortably in the chest than the answer ever would have. Chapter 24. The weight you stopped fighting. There is a particular exhaustion that belongs specifically to the fighting, not the exhaustion of the weight itself, which is real and has its own quality, but the exhaustion that is added to the weight by the sustained effort to make the weight not be there. The arguing with the impermanence, the negotiating with the uncertainty, the ongoing internal protest against the conditions of the situation that the protest cannot change, and that the protest makes heavier by adding to them the cost of the protesting. The weight that was already there, plus the weight of refusing to let the weight be there, is more than either would be alone. Most people discover this not through philosophical reflection, but through the accumulation of evidence that the fighting is not working. The anxiety that is fought becomes more anxious from the fighting. The grief that is refused becomes more persistent from the refusal. The uncertainty that is argued with becomes more destabilizing from the arguing, because the arguing treats the uncertainty as an enemy that can be defeated, rather than as a condition of the situation that cannot be defeated, and must instead be inhabited. The discovery that the fighting is not working is uncomfortable, because the fighting felt like the appropriate response. It felt active and engaged, and like the correct relationship to something difficult. The stopping of the fighting feels, from the outside of the stopping, like passivity, like giving up, like a conceding that the weight has won. But the stopping, when it actually happens, rather than being described in the abstract, does not feel like what giving up feels like. It feels different from that. The person who has genuinely stopped fighting the impermanence does not feel like someone who has been defeated by the impermanence. They feel like someone who has stopped spending energy on a project that was never going to succeed, and has found that the energy released from the project is now available for something that the project was preventing. Not the resolution of the impermanence, which is not available. Something that is available, which is the actual experience of what is actually here, while it is here, which the fighting was too loud to allow. The Buddhist concept of dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but contains more than suffering in its original meaning. It contains the specific quality of suffering that arises not from the painful circumstances themselves, but from the relationship to the circumstances. The resistance, the clinging to what will not last, the pushing away of what is here, the demand that things be other than they are. Dukkha in this analysis is not primarily caused by the impermanence and the uncertainty. It is caused by the fighting of the impermanence and the uncertainty. The impermanence itself is neutral. The relationship to the impermanence is where the suffering is generated. This is a counterintuitive observation, and it is worth sitting with the counterintuitiveness rather than rushing past it. The claim is not that painful things are not painful. It is not that loss is not loss, or that uncertainty is not uncomfortable, or that the absence of guaranteed meaning does not produce a specific kind of difficulty. The claim is more specific than this. It is that the suffering produced by the resistance to these things is distinct from the difficulty of the things themselves, and is often larger than the difficulty of the things themselves. That the arguing with the impermanence costs more than the impermanence costs. That the fighting of the uncertainty adds to the uncertainty a further burden that is made entirely of the fighting rather than of the thing being fought. The philosopher Epictetus, who was born into slavery, and whose philosophy was developed in the context of complete powerlessness over the external circumstances of his life, made the distinction between what is up to us and what is not, with the precision that his situation required. The things that are not up to us, which include everything external, the body's health, the opinions of others, the events that occur, the outcomes of our efforts, are not, in Epictetus's framework, the appropriate objects of our concern. Not because they don't matter, but because concerning ourselves with them, in the sense of fighting to control them, is a losing project that produces suffering without producing results. The things that are up to us, which are our responses, our orientations, our relationship to what is happening, are where the genuine work is available to be done. The freedom that the Stoic philosophy offers is not freedom from external circumstances, it is freedom within them. The freedom of the person who has stopped trying to control what cannot be controlled, and has turned the full force of their attention to what can be shaped, which is the quality of their relationship to the uncontrollable. This is the shape of the acceptance that this chapter is about. Not the acceptance of someone who has been defeated and has given up. The acceptance of someone who has made an accurate assessment of which battles are real and which are not, and who has concentrated their energy accordingly. The weight cannot be made to not be there. The fighting of it can be stopped, and the stopping of the fighting is not the same as the acceptance of defeat. It is the accurate recognition of what the situation actually is, which is the beginning of genuine engagement with the situation, rather than with the idea of the situation being different from what it is. The acceptance arrives differently for different people. For some it arrives gradually, through the accumulation of the evidence that the fighting is not working, through the slow learning that the relationship to the difficulty matters more than the difficulty itself. For some it arrives suddenly, in a moment that has the quality of a physical release, the specific sensation of setting down something that has been carried too long in a position that the body was not designed to maintain. For some it does not arrive at all, and the fighting continues, and the exhaustion of the fighting becomes part of the permanent texture of the life. There is no guarantee that the acceptance will be available. There is only the recognition that the fighting has a cost, and the stopping of the fighting has a different kind of cost, and that the different kind of cost, while also real, tends to be lighter. What becomes available after the stopping is not happiness in the ordinary sense. It is not the resolution of the questions that the previous 23 chapters have been sitting with. The questions remain. The impermanence remains. The uncertainty remains. The absence of guaranteed meaning remains. What changes is the relationship to these things. The person who has stopped fighting the weight of them is no longer spending energy on the fighting. The energy is now available for what is actually here, rather than for the argument about what is here being different from what it is. The ordinary moments have more room in them. The cup of coffee, and the afternoon light, and the conversation, and the unremarkable Tuesday, that is the texture of most of a life, have more capacity to be what they are, rather than being passed through on the way to something that is supposed to be better. The weight is still there. It is just not being argued with. And the not arguing creates a space in the life where the weight was taking up room that it is no longer taking up. The heaviness has been asking for this all along. Not to be solved, not to be refused, not to be made into something other than what it is, simply to be acknowledged as what it is, and carried without the additional weight of the fighting. Chapter 25. The dread that becomes wonder. There is no single moment when it changes. The dread does not announce its transformation. It does not arrive one morning as wonder, fully formed and clearly labeled, replacing the weight that was there before with something that can be comfortably named and welcomed. The alchemy is slower than that, and less dramatic and less clean. What tends to happen to people who have stayed with the dread long enough and gently enough and without the fighting that the previous chapter described is something more like a gradual shift in the quality of the same experience. The content does not change. The impermanence is still the impermanence. The uncertainty is still the uncertainty. The questions that have no clean answers are still unanswered. And the experience of being in contact with these things has a different quality than it had before. not the quality of weight and falling that the earlier chapters described. Something quieter and larger and harder to name, but recognizable once it has been felt as something other than dread. The Japanese have a word for it, or something adjacent to it, mono no aware, which appeared briefly in the first chapter of this series and deserves more space now, at the end, than it received then. It is usually translated as the pathos of things, or the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, but the translation loses something that the original contains. It is not primarily sad, it is primarily aware. The awareness of the impermanence of what is here, held with a quality of attention that is neither grasping nor pushing away, produces a feeling that is more complex than sadness and more honest than happiness. It contains both. It contains the beauty and the brevity together, as inseparable aspects of the same thing, which is what they actually are, rather than what the ordinary perception, which tries to have the beauty without the brevity, takes them to be. The cherry blossoms fall. This is the image that the concept is most often associated with in Japanese culture, and the association is apt not because cherry blossoms are more beautiful than other flowers, but because their falling is so close to their blooming. The window between the opening and the falling is so narrow that the beauty and the impermanence are simultaneous experiences rather than sequential ones. You cannot see a cherry blossom in full bloom without seeing it already beginning to fall. The beauty is inseparable from the falling. The falling is inseparable from the beauty, and the experience of holding both of these without flinching from either, the beauty fully received and the falling fully acknowledged, is the experience that the word is trying to name. This is the alchemy. The dread that has been held long enough becomes available to be experienced as this. The impermanence that produced the weight, the contingency that produced the falling feeling, the smallness that produced the vertigo, these do not change. But they can be held differently. Not because the holding has been practiced until it became easy exactly, because the holding has been practiced until the nature of what is being held has become more fully visible. And what becomes visible, when the impermanence is fully seen rather than partially seen with the part that produces only dread, is the other thing that the impermanence contains: the specificity, the thisness of what is here. The fact that the cup of coffee in the afternoon light and the face of the person across the table are this and not anything else, are here and not anywhere else, are now and not at any other time. The impermanence that was the source of the dread is also the source of the specificity. The transience that was the problem is also the thing that makes each moment this moment rather than any moment. Awe is the word that comes closest to what the dread becomes, not the theatrical awe of the dramatic revelation, not the performed awe of someone who has been told they should find something awesome and is trying to produce the appropriate response. The quieter kind, the kind that arrives in the body rather than in the theatrical register of the mind. The specific quality of being in contact with something that is larger than the frame that was being used to contain it, and finding that the not containing is not a threat but a relief. The frame falls away. The thing is what it is. The being in contact with it has a quality that the frame was preventing. The philosopher Rudolf Otto described this quality with the phrase mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that is both terrible and fascinating, both sources of dread and sources of fascination in a way that cannot be fully separated. The tremendum, the overwhelming, the quality of the sacred that produces the response of falling back, of being too small for what is being encountered, and the fascinans, the attracting quality, the thing about the overwhelming that draws rather than only repels, that produces not only the falling back but the leaning forward. The dread and the wonder are not opposites in this account. They are the two aspects of the same encounter with something that exceeds the ordinary frame. The night sky, encountered far from artificial light, which has appeared at various points in this series as an image for the cosmic scale, is also one of the most common triggers for the specific alchemy this chapter is describing. The dread at the scale of the universe and the wonder at the scale of the universe are not sequential, they are simultaneous. The same darkness that produces the smallness produces the specific quality of the stars, which are not abstract when they are actually seen, which have a presence and a vividness that the word stars does not prepare you for when you have been mostly seeing them through the competition of artificial light. The smallness and the wonder are the same experience, held from two angles simultaneously, and the holding of both is what the alchemy produces. The Sufi poet Rumi, who knew something about the transformation of difficult experience into something else, wrote about the wound and the light, with a directness that has survived centuries of translation. The wound is where the light enters, not despite the wound, through it. The image is not comfortable in the way that comfortable images are comfortable. It does not promise that the wound will be healed or that the pain will stop. It promises something different, that the wound is the opening, that the place where the dread has broken through the surface of the ordinary life is the place where something larger than the ordinary life becomes visible. The dread is not the problem. The dread is the door. This series began in the dark, with the 3 a.m. feeling and the weight that arrived without a name, and the sourceless quality of the dread that the ordinary life was not providing language for. The series has been sitting with that feeling for 25 chapters, approaching it from different angles, looking at what it is made of and where it comes from and what the tradition of human beings who felt it has produced in response to it. The sitting has not resolved the feeling. It was never going to resolve the feeling. The feeling is the appropriate response to the situation, which is the situation of being conscious and mortal and uncertain inside a universe that is vast and indifferent and also somehow astonishingly here. The astonishment is the thing the sitting eventually arrives at, not instead of the dread, alongside it, underneath it, in the same place where the dread was, but transformed by the long and gentle holding into something that the dread was always on the edges becoming. The night sky is enormous. The cup of coffee is warm. The morning will come, and the morning will not always come, and you are here, in the specific and unrepeatable arrangement of this moment, which the whole history of the universe conspired to produce, and which will not come again, and is right now, exactly, this.